We ready to get started?
You can start whenever you feel prepared.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March 6th Tank Waste Stewardship and Treatment Committee meeting. My name is Lindsay Summers. I'm the DDFO for the Hanford site. Just have a few reminders before we get started. The first one is this meeting will be conducted in accordance with the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And the last one is each member has a joint responsibility for assuring that the operating ground rules are observed and discussions are conducted in a respectful manner. I appreciate your attendance today and I look forward to our briefing. Josh?
Thank you. A couple administrative notes before we get started. These meetings are recorded and will be posted to the Hanford YouTube page. If you're returning from this morning's meetings, note that the in-room sign-in is separate from this morning's. Please sign in on this one as well. Most eager among you can have a donut. And if you haven't already, please sign in at the front desk and take that in.
I think, my name is Rob Davis. I'm chairman of the committee here. Rob Parmalee is the vice chair, and he's not in attendance. I think we owe thanks to Ryan for the donuts. Is that right?
And the meeting space.
And the meeting space. Yes, thank you very much. Just a brief note, folks, that last meeting we had in January, we had a great discussion with the Tank Integrity Program from Eric Nelson with DOE and Jason Gunner from Warps. The discussion is now on the website. So if you care to take a look at that briefing, it's there. Go ahead, down, click to Tank Waste, and you'll see the meeting notes. The second part of the meeting, we talked a lot about our draft advice for the priorities. And then we had a nice open forum. Today, we have two subjects on our meeting here. One is the direct feed LAW or DF law. And we'll have a presentation by Matt Irwin. And then System Plan 10, which we've been all waiting to see, hopefully. They've been out for several months now, and it's a very interesting document, kind of lengthy, but it's got a lot of good information. For anybody new to the site or new to understanding, the one thing that I noticed in the beginning of the system plan is a great discussion of all the various facilities on the site and what they do. So also within the system plan, there's all kinds of other information. So Matt, are you ready?
And would you like to do a round of introductions?
Oh, gosh, yes. Yes, let me do some introductions, please.
Let's go counterclockwise this time. We'll start.
Tom Rogers, Washington State Department of Health.
Jane LePage, Washington State Department of Health.
Matt Irwin, DOE, WTP. Dan McDonald with Ecology. Paul Zimmer, Ecology.
Judy Talbot, Facilitation Team.
Josh Patton, Facilitation Team.
Jacob Reynolds, non-union, non-management, tab number.
Content Urban and Parker Foundation at WSU.
Larry Grant, Community at Large.
Rob Davis, I represent the city of Pasco.
Mia Burke, Hanford Challenge.
Marianne Waneke, HMIS. Lindsay Summers, DOE. Laura Caulfield, Attanex.
And with that,
Public at large.
alright. We'll go down the list online. When you're ready to speak, please unmute your microphone. I'll go down as I see them. We got Brian.
West Bryan, WRPS.
Patrick.
This is Rob
Amanda.
Parmalee. I am online. I'll be online till about 2 o'clock.
Thank you. Suzanne,
Dan Strong, Benton Franklin Health District.
Dave,
I think we jumped Suzanne there, but this is Dave DeSimone with Ecology.
Yep.
Yeah.
Suzanne Dahl, Washington State Department of Ecology.
Gary,
Gary Younger, DOE.
Matt,
Matt Hendrickson, Oregon Department of Energy.
Matthew,
Matthew Campbell, Confederated Tribes of Umatilla.
Dana,
Dana McFadden, Department of Ecology.
Mo, hold on, Steve,
Steve Needles, Department of Ecology.
Dan, you want to try again?
Oh, so muted.
And Michael.
I'm Michael Turner with HMIS.
And we have 2 participants joining by phone. I'll note to reduce background noise, if unmuted. And when you're ready to speak, please press *6. Phone number ending in 6950. All right. Phone number ending in 6311. That concludes introductions.
Okay. So, Matt,
You ready?
show is yours.
All right, you can let me start 8 minutes early. That's great.
Matt, do you need a pointer? Or are you good?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
We'll see. You guys can tell me if you think I need a pointer, you can point that out. All right, so as I said before, and I know a number of you have, I'm gonna say had to suffer through, but that's, you can pick your own, adjective. Through me talking about DFLAW before, so it'll be similar to that. Matt over WTP, I'm the acting assistant manager for WTP, managing both DFLAW and then HLW. Today our focus is going to be WTP. We can switch to the next slide. And really what I want to do is give you an update on where we are on DFLAW. And this is really for information. Obviously we can have a dialogue. There are lots of moving parts and happy to talk about some of those moving parts, but it's really just information. Next slide. This next slide, I think you've all already seen before, but it's really just to try to highlight the journey that we're on. Where we are now, we do have Melter 1 heated up. We've actually poured 4 canisters, 4 full canisters. One we've taken all the way through the export bay. Another one is in the finishing line. And then the other 2 are staged to go through the finishing line. And I'm going to talk a lot about the ground that we've covered. But Melter 1 currently off-gas system is in auto. And all of that is running just fine. And we're on the cusp of starting to heat up on Melter 2 within the next few days. We'll talk about that here as well. This does also highlight from a readiness standpoint, and that's really the reason why we created this. We've got a number of operational checklists that the contractor does before they do key activities, for example, Melter 2 heat up. And then we also have the formal readiness that we DOE do, and that's to support things like the cold commissioning management assessment, and eventually the contractor operational readiness review that allows us to get into hot commissioning. So this is just trying to highlight the climb. The climb has gotten steeper over time. That's not a surprise. The more systems we put on operating in parallel, the more complicated that is. There's a lot of learning going on, and that's actually part of the design. So not unexpected, but I like to highlight this because this is really from a big picture standpoint. Next slide. Okay, so we've covered all of this ground. This is really just to highlight, and if you haven't gone and watched the animation that's on YouTube, Bit Plant Melter Heat Up animation, I would encourage you to do that because that'll do a far better job. I guess I'll just highlight, we're about to start this process with Melter 2, but for Melter 1, back in June, we initiated the startup heaters. We heated it all up. We had to do all the jack Fulton measurements to make sure everything was aligned properly. We filled it with glass. We put the Joule heaters online, took out the startup heaters, and all of that is complete on Melter 1, and we're right on the front end of that for Melter 2. That's why I wanted to put this in here. It's really just review, but it still highlights where we are on the 2 melters. 1 is all the way through this, 2 is just about to start it. Next slide. All right, so this is just a commissioning update, a little bit of historical, as I already alluded to. Back in June, we had the starter feeders in Melter 1. Today, if you walk out there, you have to go, I don't know, 30 feet east, and you're gonna see all those cables hooked up on Melter 2, because the starter feeders are all in Melter 2 today. In August is when we first added frit in Melter 1. If we get into Melter 2 heat up here in the next few days, we're about a month out from starting to add frit on Melter 2. This is just when we did the first frit pour, and then they also, the image of the first frit of molten glass. I think that was a west discharge chamber. But we poured out both discharge chambers. We've also, and I'll talk about it here in a minute, we've also calibrated the IR cameras. That's one of the ways we check level, the other is weight. So that's all been validated. There's also a video of that IR camera and the glass also on YouTube. So if you're, those are fun things to go watch. So that's just a high level snapshot and then just a couple key pictures. Next slide. This actually shows the container 47. No, it wasn't container 1, but it is the first container that went through the process and got filled with glass. This is a picture in the finishing line, and this is when it just got folded up in the finishing line. Very popular picture because you can see the glass in the container. Very exciting for those of us who've been, actually, it should be exciting for everyone in the room. And then the last one is that container 47 actually coming out of the finishing line into the export bay. And then it got put down in the export bay. And if we go to the next slide, if you haven't been out there, I would encourage you to go out to the export bay. If you haven't had an opportunity to go out there and sign it, there's very little free space on it, but I would encourage you to go do it. It is a sense of pride, right? I would tell you, personally, I was happy to put my name on that. And I hope any of you who get the chance do the same. It's the culmination of a heck of a lot of really hard work by a lot of really smart people. We're not done, but it is a significant step in the journey. And as you can see, a lot of people took the opportunity to tie their name to that first container. So I would encourage you to do the same. The next one is it's the IR camera when they were calibrating it. There's an emissivity strip. That's what that white portion of the container with the IR cameras in operation. They were calibrating at the level in this particular case is right there where the white line is. Both east and west discharge chambers in Melter 2, Melter 1. Sorry, I will apologize. I may say Melter 2, but Melter 2 is what's on my head right now because that's where we're trying to drive to. So I apologize if I do that, but that's a slip just because that's where my brain is. But did get both of those calibrated. And like I said, there's a video that actually shows the pour starting and then what that does on the IR camera. It's kind of cool if you get a chance to look at that. Next slide. Okay, the reason I wanted to show this is we were making really good momentum up until about October, and then we ran into a problem where, and we knew there had been an in-leakage problem, and it was somewhat mitigated when we heated up the container, the melter, and we filled it with glass. That did decrease the amount of in-leakage, but it didn't decrease it enough that we were still getting overheating on the film cooler, and the film cooler is right at the top of the melter. When that off gas comes off, when it's at its hottest point, that film cooler cools that down so that it's not potentially damaging components downstream in the off gas. And so we had to have supplemental cooling on the film cooler through that initial commissioning activities because of that in leakage. So in October, we recognized that a significant part of it was coming up through the discharge chamber where the air lance is, the air lance channel, and then over the lid into the plenum. So when you tried to pull the plenum to -5 inches, we would get a whole bunch of increased flow, which would then take that heat up to the film cooler and challenge the film cooler. So there was a modification design, and this is actually what it looks like right there on the right. That's the plug there, right at the bottom of this rack. That plug would actually go down and seat at the top of the chamber that the air lance goes into, but that would separate it from the lid where there was a gap between the lid and the side of the melter. So a small gap, but it doesn't take very much to get quite a bit of airflow. So we got those fabricated on the East Coast. There was a little glitch that lost us a couple of weeks because one of the pieces of this is multiple pieces. There's 2 discs with some beveling on them, and one of those wasn't in the right spot when we got the first 2, so we had to send it back and get it addressed. But that got installed here in late January, early February. As we were getting ready for this, they did some additional testing on the in leakage and what it was causing for other components. And this picture on the left is the discharge chamber. So in this area of the discharge chamber, it's outside of the boundary of the melter plenum. But there's the electrical components where they plug in the thermocouples and those things are in that area. So that is, and it was intended to have some natural airflow that would keep it at the right temperatures. But what we were seeing was elevated temperatures, particularly when we took steps to reduce the in leakage problem. So they had to design a cooling airflow. So this cooling, and it works very much like the process cells do, which is it uses the negative ventilation of the annulus, which is less negative than, and I apologize, this is technical, but I'm sharing it with you because it's important for what we did on the in leakage is this allows the air that's at a hot, closer to ambient to be drawn in across the cooling of the discharge panel. And it's in the top, it's outside of the melter airspace. And then it pulls it into the annulus, which is a little bit more negative than the gallery. And then more negative than that is the plenum. So we had to put this in there to get a little bit more cooling flow. So this got put in the late January timeframe. Immediately prior to putting in the air lances, it was completely effective. That part of the chamber now is at the temperatures that should be. It's operating exactly as intended. And when we put these air lances in, the plugs, we put those in early February. We were able to get immediately to -5 inches without challenging the film cooler. They stress test that. They tried to put it through perturbations to confirm that we weren't going to challenge the film cooler at our highest flows and highest negative vacuums in the plenum. And it passed all of that. So the supplemental cooling on the film cooler has been removed. And the off gas is now in auto. It was in manual for a long time to make sure that we weren't challenging the film cooler. Because if you challenge the film cooler, then you're challenging the things that are downstream. So that's a really significant positive. The negative is from October to December, this was our critical path. So we were making very little progress on the critical path. We now have proven this. It is working. We are in auto. We also have made these same changes to melter 2. So those are things that will allow us to actually accelerate the heat up and check out of melter 2 because all those lessons learned have been rolled into melter 2. So I'm going to stop. I know I apologize. I know that's somewhat technical and I'm not trying to confuse you, but it's an important point to understand why in the months of October and November and December, things weren't moving at the same pace as we would prefer. Any questions on that?
Just a comment, Matt, could you comment on the idea that what you're looking for is balanced airflow, not too little, not too much?
Yeah, so the facility was designed at the plenum is at -5, nominally -5 inches with a particular flow that goes with that -5. So that's a good example, that's a good reinforcement of why we could get to -5 before we put that plug in, but it was at a much higher flow rate. And when we're outside that flow rate, that challenges, not only does it challenge from a heat standpoint, which is what I said, but it also challenges if we have upset conditions when we're operating the plant, there are interlocks in that off-gas system that will stop the feed of the glass and put the plant in a safe condition and burn off the cold cap. And if you have too high a flow, then you're challenging your ability to get the right timing on those interlocks. Is that what you're wanting me to talk about then? And conversely, if you're too low a flow, then you got to reset all of those interlocks as well. So we have those all set when it was cold. But we recognize we're going to have to validate them when it's hot, and there probably will be some adjustments on those interlocks. And all of that testing will have to occur prior to actually introducing the stimulant that would create the chemical hazards like NOx. So that's why these are all very critical steps that we go through is to make sure that we got the right flow with the right vacuum, make sure that the system can run in auto, make sure that we can then validate all of those, they're called safety instrumented systems, but the SIS test, the safety instrumented function, that those all happen in the right timing so that when they occur, first of all, the off-gas system operates properly, and second of all, you burn off the cold cap in a safe way. Today, we don't have a cold cap because it's just virgin glass, but we're gonna go to simulant, and when we operate it with the actual rad feed, we will have a cold cap, and we have to mitigate those hazards and control them. Did I need to go any more than that, Dan? Is that?
Not for me, but I wanted everybody to understand that, one, this is a controlled process. And it has to be done in a certain order in order for it to work.
Yeah, well, as an example, one of the other tests we do, when you add feed, you're adding liquid, right? What do we think liquid does when it hits 2100 degrees? The water part's gonna flash to steam, and that's gonna create a pressure pulse. So we wanna make, and by the way, we haven't done that test yet, but that's another test, is put it at -5, have feed, which to start off with, it's just gonna be water, but then show that the ventilation system and everything downstream all compensates for that flash of steam. Because that's what we're gonna have to do every day when we feed the melter. Now, we don't have any indication that that's gonna be a problem, as long as we have the right flows and the right vacuum, which today we have those. Now we can go do that test. Other questions? Yeah.
You referred to this tube. Is this the bubbler?
No,
You're talking about?
no. This is the air lamps.
The air lamp.
So, yeah, the bubblers go in the lid, and those are mixing the glass. The air lances go in the discharge chamber. So when we want to pour, you apply a little bit of air pressure in this little leg, and it causes the glass to rise, and then it pours out through the pour spout. And that's what this one is. And by the way, it's a good question, because if you just look at pictures like this, they look very much alike, right? The bubblers have the same refractory. They have 2 legs instead of 1, but they look a lot alike, especially if you're just looking at a picture like that. Good question. Any others?
Before launching fully into questions, do we want to run through the rest of the presentation?
Yeah, I'm not all done. You're right. I'm sorry. I know you guys usually do it at the end. I apologize. My normal frame of reference is I don't want to lose you and then have people worried about 3 slides ago. So I apologize. I should have done that. Next slide. And I also know I talk really fast, so giving you guys a minute to take a deep breath is probably worthwhile as well. Okay, so this is really just, I've talked a little bit about this. So the first bullet is, where are we on melter 1? We have off gas and automatic. We are working at adding glass formers in the process cells in the mixed melter prep feed vessel. I always get the letters backwards. So that we can add the glass formers, and then we will get to the point where we can feed melter 1 from the process cells. Up to this point, we've been feeding melter 1 through the lid, which is one of the pictures I showed you a minute ago. And it's literally just a bag of glass frit, and we pour it down through a funnel into the melter. We're now working on being able to feed it from the process cell side, which is how we'll feed it when we get into operation. So that's a test sequence that we're working on right now. That'll include ongoing glass pours. So we're going to continue. We just had a glass pour on Sunday. So we continue to pour glass into containers. We'll continue to fill them. I told you we've got 1 in the finishing line and 2 more. That's exercising the mechanical handling part of our process and the lidding part of the process. So we'll work those other 3 here through. Once we actually, and to be honest, we're going to get to those as soon as melter 2 heat up starts. One of the things we don't want is as a facility to be worried about 4 things, one of them being the critical path, and then trip up on the critical path. So right now, the laser focus is melter 2 heat up. If you hadn't heard, one of the discharge chamber, so that's where the air lance is, one of the cooling panels on the outside of that developed a very small leak. It was about a gallon an hour, plus or minus, but it was not a very big leak, but it was a cooling water leak. It's not in an easily accessible spot, so they had to put a borescope down. They had to go validate the leakage. They went and got a test skid. From that test skid, they also created a bunch of coupons, and the coupons were just basically pipe where they used a laser or other means to create holes that were similar in size and orientation to the one that we had on the discharge on the plant. And then they used multiple 8 different sealants to actually, you have to prep the pipe, you have to heat it to a certain temperature, and then you add a sealant. That sealant can close off that hole, and then you can continue to operate. The other option, unfortunately, would have been if we replaced that cooling panel, because these are designed for the life of the melter. So they come in with the melter, they live for 5 years, and then that's the end of their life. So to get to it, if we wanted to literally replace it, we would have had to cut a side out of the discharge chamber. That now creates problems with integrity and the other systems that you had to cut. So using a sealant was the preferred approach. That sealant was added day before yesterday, and they had to do some flushing because it didn't adhere the way they thought. It got added again yesterday morning. It got tested yesterday to 60 pounds. It got tested today to 70 pounds. And as of right now, assuming my morning data was accurate. It's holding, they'll do a 24-hour run starting tomorrow. In parallel with that, we're doing the prereqs for Melter 2 heat up. And this is last month's slide, because it's actually within the next few days. We could be starting up before the weekend or on the weekend. So Melter 2 heat up will start this weekend. We expect it to go faster than Melter 1 because we've learned a number of things relative to components and how they operate. So we'll get into Melter 2 heat up starting this weekend. That nominally should put us at temperature before the end of March. Nominally put us in a point where we're actually pouring glass. That means filling up with glass, getting on joule heating, removing the startup heaters in the late April timeframe. All of those timeframes support our cold commissioning schedule and getting into cold commissioning. And the CCMA, the forecast today shows that in July. We have 28 days of risk in the Melter 2 heat up. If we actually are able to achieve Melter 2 heat up with the lessons learned and they're successful, we won't use that 28 days, and that would put the cold commissioning management assessment in more the mid to late June timeframe, which supports our original schedule. So that's where we are now. We can shift and ask any questions that you like. So sorry for being a little bit out of sync.
One more step before questions. I'd like to offer the regulators an opportunity to provide perspective. I see we have several people from the phone, in the room and online.
Yeah, we're gonna go to Suzanne Dahl for a college's perspective. Suzanne?
Yeah, so Matt, thank you for doing that. You always do a great job, and I think provide the right level of detail. There's so many exciting things going on. I know that several of our staff members were super proud and joyful to sign that canister, and normally my picture behind me is the canister or the picture inside showing the glass. So I I think things are going really well. People may or may not be aware we have a very specialized set of permit conditions called technical assistance permit conditions that that we're using now, and we'll use them into operations that allow us to respond really quickly and have really defined streamlined processes for helping with any permit modifications that need to happen because things need to be changed in the field in a real-time basis. And we have folks on, you know, on call and able to address those things as they develop, even if they occur during non-traditional work hours. I know one thing that we're excited to come present to the HAB and do a joint presentation on in the future is the environmental demonstration, the environmental performance and demonstration test plan, which you do on thermal units before you start them up and before you put hot waste on them. You go through this demonstration test to make sure that everything's operating the way it should, both with the melter and with the off-gas systems, and it all gets compared to risk assessment numbers to make sure that the environment's being protective. So that's a detailed conversation that we couldn't do here, but that we're excited to find time on your guys' schedule to come and be able to present that to you. And Dan, I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add since you're sitting in the room.
Just a bit on the environmental performance demonstration test. That is a critical juncture point in the process control strategy. That test needs to be done in such a way that we can, to the greatest extent possible, see to it that we're close to 100% total operating efficiency or very close to that. Because the results of that particular test will then guide, if you will, how we go forward into operations. So it's critically important that through technical assistance and working together, that we ensure that we can get the most out of this system the first time through to ensure that operations will go as we hope they will go.
That's it for us, Josh.
So, I don't see anyone I recognize from EPA online. Speak up and let me know if I'm wrong. But otherwise, I think we are ready to move to committee questions. We have one listener queue. I'd like to note that anyone online that would like to join can type something in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Our phone participant, as a reminder, you can unmute with *6, you'll just have to butt in. And those in the room, in the blind spot, might have to be a little animated to get my attention. All right. Matt, would you like to lead us off?
Sure, I've got a couple of quick ones. You're referencing -5 as the pressure differential. Is that in inches of water column?
That is correct.
Okay. And the other one, what's the nominal operating pressure of that cooling system that sprung a leak?
It's a little bit under 40.
Okay, so you're almost doubling it for the pressure test.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I will say it is adjustable, but normally it's just under 40.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I was gonna ask some questions. For some reason, my phone keeps doing this thing and I put it on silent. So when do you expect the environmental performance test?
That'd be by the end of the calendar year.
End of calendar year, so we should expect maybe.
So I completely agree with Suzanne of its importance, but it was a couple of steps farther down the road, so
Right.
I put my cutoff at the coal commissioning management assessment, but I absolutely agree of its importance.
Okay, so could you describe a little bit of the mechanical handling process for getting the canister around and how long it stays in the cooling and what is, how long it took to cool down and lidding and things of that sort?
If you guys had a whiteboard, it would make it easier, but yeah, okay, I will. Will that work? Okay, I'm gonna say my drawing skills are really bad, but I think it'll probably help if I put it up on the whiteboard, if that's okay.
There should be a marker behind the board in the middle there.
You guys expect me to find things?
I think. Okay, yeah.
All right, I just want to make sure I don't write it on there permanently. Okay, so if you think of law like this, let's see, this being north. Oh, sorry, I'll mess it up right at the beginning. So the containers come in at this end. They come in and they go down into the, I'm gonna call it the basement, but underground. And there's a tunnel down there. So the container comes in, it goes down into the tunnel. It comes. How many people have seen the, I'll call it, well, it's the round table, but the Lazy Susan? Okay, so for those of you who've seen it, you won't have to depend on my poor art skills. But basically there's a lazy, I call it the lazy, is what I call it. But the container comes down, there's 2 rail tracks. It can come down on 1 of 2 bogies. So first you gotta get a crane that takes it off the truck. You gotta get a crane that drops it. It goes on the little conveyor. And then it's gotta go down into the basement. So there's another crane there to drop it down to there. Then it comes over to the 1 of the 2 discharge chute doors. And it can go on either one of the, so there's 2 sets of tracks. Each one has a bogie on it that's laser controlled. It takes it down, container goes onto that Lazy Susan. The first one is where the empty container goes. It's got 3 spots: the empty spot, the filling spot, and the cooling spot. Nominally, when we're operating at our design flow, you're going to nominally have an 8-hour rotation on each one of those. So it goes into the empty spot. The one that's filling will fill over an 8-hour time frame. You're gonna take that one to the cooling. The empty will go to the filling. And then in theory, the one that was in the cooling is now ready to be taken off. So nominally, the cooling in this is gonna be around 8 hours. Now, obviously, if we pour at a lower rate, then it'll sit in cooling for longer. And there's cooling panels all around this room. And then there's cooling panels around both the discharge chamber and the melter and the lid itself. So there's a crane that takes it in here, sets it on here. Then there's an elevator when it swaps to that filling spot. The elevator will actually lift it up so that it mates with the discharge chute. It goes 5 feet, 6, I don't know. It's up a little ways, but it's a pretty tall container too. So, and we alternatingly pour from east and west discharge chutes. So I'm not gonna draw you melter 2 because it's right here. So you basically, though, you've got a crane here, 2 cranes here, and I think it's only 1 crane here. But then when it comes down here to the finishing line, There's another crane that takes it and puts it into the finishing line. That picture, oh, no, the slide's up there. But the picture that had the 4 guys standing in front of the container, that's the finishing line. That's back up at ground level. So it brings it up into the finishing line, and then it goes through a series, and each one of these areas has a crane to move it. So it comes into the finishing line, and it gets set into a particular spot. That it's another bogey. That bogey can move it over, and then it gets lifted into the next spot. So there's a spot for just the general inspection, and there's a spot for it's got the robot for doing the swipe survey on it for rad contamination, and then it's got a lidding spot. And the lidding spot has well, you could actually see it in one of those pictures, where you see the picture that's got glass and you see an arm kind of sitting next to it. That's the lidding attachment. It just happens to be sitting right there, but it sets on top of the container, and it takes basically a steel plate with a rim around it, and it puts it into the top of that container, and then it pushes out the sides.
Uh-oh.
And it's just a contact mechanical, yeah. So that happens in here, and when you get through the survey robot and confirm it's clean, then it gets lifted out of the finishing line. That's the picture that showed the one where it's coming up, it's just sitting up in the air when I said it was in the export bay. That's pulling out of the finishing line and bringing it over to the export bay. In theory, it would be setting it into the truck. Right now, we're just setting these test class containers into the export bay, and then they're ready to go on the transporter over to IDF. Does that help? Is that what you were hoping for?
But yeah, and that's been successfully demonstrated.
It has been successfully demonstrated, but it's not at the rate we'll get to eventually. We've gone through that cycle 100% on one container, and we've got one sitting in the finishing line right now and 2 more to go. So we'll be cycling that hundreds of times over the next year, but.
Are you getting much glass spatter?
That hasn't been any that I've seen.
Okay, that was an issue with Savannah River.
Yeah, I haven't seen any yet. But we've also been pretty slow and deliberate in our pours. And I'm not saying we're gonna get sloppy, but I'm just saying, right, when you're pouring longer, and I will say, if you go watch that video, you'll see that the pour does it with the air flows, you'll see it actually kind of, move back and forth along that lip that it's pouring over. But we haven't seen any splatter yet. But now you've jinxed it, because the next pour will have some. So I'm blaming you when that happens.
All right.
And if it never happens, then it was just meant to be. Okay, anyways, other questions?
Just a quick one.
Matt's in the queue and then.
And I think Mia was in the queue.
Right, okay.
Okay, but Matt, lead us off.
All right. Don't mean to beat this dead horse, but the cooling water system, was that a weld, a material thinness, corrosion problem, anything like that? Any investigation of that leak and how it formed?
So there has been some investigation. It's not on a weld, it's not on a joint, it's on a straight stretch of the pipe. And there's some belief that because the chemistry control was erratic, that's allowed for some corrosion on that spot. It also could be a defect as received, but because of where it's located, it's really hard to get to a definitive answer. They have increased the monitoring and surveillance of the other elements of the cooling panels around the melter, and haven't seen any other evidence. We haven't had evidence of that kind of a defect or hole in melter 1, and this was the only spot that we had in a melter 2. So I can't tell you definitively that we know the root cause, but we do know that there's some level of corrosion. If you see and I know you haven't, but if you see the pictures, you can see there's some corrosion that went along with that.
Okay, yeah, I haven't seen those pictures. Okay.
That's bad on me. I didn't bring that particular. Now, that particular picture, by the way, is only a few days old. That gives you a good view of the corrosion, but, so I apologize, but.
We'll chalk it up to my being out sick. How about that?
All right.
Quick cue check. Feel free to flag me down if I missed you. Pam, Mia, Jacob, and Bob. Pam, Lisa.
Mine's real quick. Are both of the turntables ready to go? Obviously, the first one is, you're using it.
All 4 are, yes.
Oh, there are 4.
So 2 per melter. So the 2 we've been using in melter 1, but the 2 in melter 2 have also been tested and proven that they're functional. Now, we haven't done it with a full container, but we put containers on it, rotated and lifted it up to the pour spout. So they're all four ready to go.
Probably the last time we got to go, look, it was just two.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Yeah. Yeah, the last two have been getting ready for melter to heat up.
Thank you, that's it.
I have a few. The first one is, where on here does the environmental performance demonstration test?
It's
fit?
right before the ORR, which is at the top.
Okay,
So we will have gone through all of the co-commissioning testing with the commissioning simulant that actually creates NOx. And at the very tail end of that is when we do the EPDT, right before we do the ORR.
okay.
And so that's a really good point. It probably makes sense to include that on that. We were focused on readiness. But the reality is that's a good test that would have been worth highlighting. So thanks for pointing that out.
So you were saying that for the environmental performance demonstration test, that would be end of calendar year 2024 timing?
Yeah, that's
Is
right.
expected, and then ORR, when would that be?
That'll be in early 25, so anywhere from January to March, April. I'm telling you, the forecast today shows that happening in early April.
April 2025,
That's correct.
okay.
It's a good question. I'd like to say April 24, but we have a few steps to get to before then.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to understand better, you're talking about the leakage problem. And the way it sounded to me, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that it was dependent also on like hot and cold temperatures outside. So like in the, like weather related, is that correct or not at all?
No, so I'm sorry if I led you to believe that. For everybody who has your slides, if you go to this slide number 8, the left side is a diagram of the discharge chamber. And so what you see where the green is and the blue, that's above where the electronics are. But if you look on the, literally where the red HEPA filter is, just to the left of that and behind that panel is where the cooling panel is. So there's cooling panels inside that enclosed chamber, right up against the discharge chamber itself. So on the other side are heaters, and then obviously the spout where the glass pours through. So you want to keep it hot for the glass, but you want to keep it cold for the structural members around it, so we don't overheat that. So those cooling panels are actually affixed to that side of the discharge chamber. So when maybe it might have been the way I said it, so if I confuse it, I apologize. But the water chemistry of that coolant, liquid coolant, was inconsistently controlled. And what I mean by that is it wasn't always in spec, and they weren't always prompt at getting it back into spec. So they believe that contributed to some additional corrosion. And then there's a belief that there's probably some defect on that. It's a straight part of pipe, so it's not a weld, and it's not an elbow or anything like that. It's along a straight part of the pipe. And so it's believed that there was some defect in that part of the pipe, which then was exacerbated by some corrosion with the material inside. So there isn't any belief that it was from heat outside or from the external air that's in that chamber.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah.
These are 304 stainless steel, correct?
You can't quote me on that. I think the answer is yes. That top part I know for a fact is Inconel. But I think that's correct, but don't quote me on that because I don't have that to memory. The only reason I know, by the way, that the top is Inconel because we had to have special bits to drill through it to support this cooling modification that I talked to you about before. Yeah.
All right, can I either ask 2 questions or be put on the queue in the back, one of the 2?
If you got time to ask him.
Okay, so the first question, so, you obviously have airflow, if you have in leakage. Are you running the primary off gas, secondary off gas, both, neither? And in terms of flow rate?
The entire, and I didn't highlight this, right? For law, there's a cascading ventilation system. You've got the gallery areas, the annulus area, then the plenum area. All of those are all fully functioning. The only one that was in manual during this time frame was the off gas, which pulls the vacuum on the plenum. All of the others have been operated in auto for months.
Okay.
So yeah, they're all functional. Now, the other thing as a point, both melters go through their primary off gas. They each have their own primary off gas, and then secondary is where they combine the secondary off gas.
Yeah.
So the primary and the secondary for melter one have been functioning, and it's now an auto. Bringing the primary on for melter two is something we just did this week. So that brings the primary on and then connects to the secondary, which is for both melters. Does that make sense? And so the answer to your question is, as of today, they're all running. There are a couple of instruments on melter two that as of yesterday weren't giving the right readings, and so they're grooving. They replaced it for a moment last night, one of the instruments. So the airflow is happening, but we don't have it such that the melter two primary off gas is ready to be put into auto. So that's the most complete answer I can give you.
Yeah, you know, so my thought is if you were running, you know, all those systems pressurized and the only problem you're having is what you showed, you know, you're doing pretty good.
So I will tell you, one of my biggest worries was the cascading ventilation and having them all balanced.
Yeah.
Yes, we had some trouble with the plenum, but I was pleasantly surprised with C3 and C5 that those have been as, now, one of the, if you take a lot of tours out there, you'll have noticed, and this was probably a year ago, that all of a sudden there were signs on doors that either said don't enter, or the airlocks were very deliberate to make sure, hey, don't open this door till that one's closed. And if you went on tours, you're like, you had people saying, hey, we gotta make sure that door's closed before we open this other one. That's because when we first put it on, yes, if you open both of those doors in the airlock, it would cause the system to get itself out of alignment, and it didn't like that. Fortunately, we've got the people part. And what I mean by that is people actually following those. And, you know, it used to be, if you were, and I'm sure remember you've been out there during construction, right? During construction, it was, hey, if there's a door, you use it. Well, now that the ventilation system's on, you don't just go use any door wherever, because if you do, you're gonna upset the ventilation system a little bit. Now granted, it should self-correct itself, but as anyone who's played with ventilation knows, when it's early in its life, you can get surprises if you open the wrong door for the wrong duration. So we've worked through those bugs, and we've got the people using the right doors and the right configuration, and now it's been pretty stable. Now, I'm not gonna say that we won't run into a problem. I don't know what it'll be, but we might. But with the exception of the plenum and the off gas, everything else was pretty stable.
All right, my second question is a lot different than that. So, you know, if there could come a time where there is an outage or feed issues in the tank farm for an extended period of time, 3 months, 6 months, year and a half, whatever. And, you know, what happens to all the people at the bid plant? Do you need all of them, or do you repurpose them to shovel-ready tank farm projects, or do you?
So that's a what-if question. So I'm 100% in speculation, because I wouldn't tell you that we have a deliberate plan. I will tell you what the first solution. The first part of that solution would be, hey, what are the elements of HLW design and/or right now would be HLW low-risk construction? If your hypothetical was 3 years from now, it'd be a little more complicated because that operating of DFLAW would be under the new contract, the operating contract. And in that case, they probably would manage the resources under a tank farms contract. If that were to happen, let's just say, because I do have a contract in place for extended hot commissioning, and that's really just to allow that new operating contractor to be at the right level of transition, so that then we DOE say, hey, transition DFLAW over to the operating contractor. So we want some flexibility, right? We don't want to. Somebody has it tomorrow. I mean, literally that's what happens, but we want to do that in a deliberate way, right? We don't want that to just be haphazard. So if hypothetically we were in extended hot commissioning and we were getting the rad feed and something happened, I would tell you the way we've been managing resources right now would be similar. Today, if we have a critical thing and we need it, let's just say we need an HVAC engineer and the smartest person in HVAC is working for HLW, then they would come over today and support DFLAW, and they'd charge to DFLAW for a month to solve that problem. So today, I would tell you we would do it the other way. If this happened while it was still under Bechtel, we would manage those resources to the degree that made sense to support HLW. And obviously, we're not in any hurry to get rid of our key smart resources. So we would mitigate it to the degree we could with that. Now, I'm not saying it's not, it's hypothetically possible, and don't anyone say, and I know you're recording this, so I want to make sure it's clear. I'm not saying we would lay off anyone in that scenario, but that's what we would look at. We would look at how do you repurpose them to support the technical needs of HLW, and it could be craft needs too. And then how do we make sure, because even if we're not getting feed, we still have to maintain the plant, we still have to do glass pours on some periodicity, because you can't just leave the glass in there indefinitely in the melter, that's not good for the melter. So we repurpose based upon the needs of the plant, the needs of HLW, and then if it was post-transition operations, that would get managed in the tank park. Does that help? I know that's not a crisp answer, but that's what we would work through.
Sounds good.
Okay, the last person in our queue at the moment is Bob.
I'm trying to understand the impact of that cooling leak in the long term. So this is one panel on melter 2.
Yep.
You sealed the leak, you isolated the leak, is that what you did, or did you actually?
It's sealed, so we added the sealant only to a portion of the overall cooling panel system that's around the entire melter and the discharge, but it's not literally something you could just turn some valves and isolate that portion. We had to actually make a physical disconnect, put some flanges on, and then we're reconnecting it right now today, as a matter of fact. So that way we only added the sealant to a small portion of the overall cooling system. And then we confirmed that that leak was mitigated. If it were to come back in a weeping way, and what I mean by it's very small, we may add sealant again. If it were to be catastrophic, then we have to go take more, we'd have to actually go disconnect those flanges I just mentioned to and isolate it. And we probably have to take some steps to evaluate the cooling in the discharge chamber. But at this point, and I will tell you, they did do the modeling, this is a particularly low heat load, so we are providing the same level of cool, that's too strong. Similar, the flow rates and the pressure are all the same, but the amount of cooling that's going on is higher around the melter because the melter has the heat load. Less around the discharge chamber, but it does have some heat load, but not as much because it's not glass there all the time. There's a little part of the, if I had another graphic, it would show you, the glass in the discharge chamber is a very small amount, except when you're using the air lamp to push it up over the edge. So there's a large portion, including this side, which is where these cooling panels are. This side of the discharge chambers don't have any glass on that part of the discharge chamber. So the heat load there is much lower. I can't give you numbers because I haven't seen the numbers. I was told we just got the analysis a few days ago and I will be seeing them soon. But in all likelihood, if we had to isolate this, it would not challenge the integrity of the discharge chamber. And they did that analysis. And I've been told that is a true statement, but obviously we don't want to operate the melter in a disabled state. We want it to be fully functional. Now, the reality is it was only supposed to be there for 5 years. So if we created some leak 2 years in, maybe that leak comes back, we add the sealant. If it's a manageable leak, we might, I'm not gonna tell you, it's possible we could live with it. I don't know that off the top of my head. So I don't have those answers. I do have the answer today, which is that the sealant has held. There is an expectation that that will continue. They are also creating a mitigation. There's another way to seal that this kind of a system would be sealed, and that's to use epoxy on the outside of the pipe. What that would require is drilling a hole, so they wouldn't actually have to cut to take out the whole panel, but drilling a hole at the location of that, and then going and applying the epoxy using a borescope and some kind of tool that applies it. So we have a second layer of defense if we have to go down that path. But we didn't exercise, I would rather not be cutting into the structural part of the discharge chamber if we can avoid it. So I know that's not a perfect answer. The other thing is that they have engaged with the vendor for melter 3. It's the same people that made these two melters, just to make sure that we take a look at that area. We also did take out that section of the cooling panel for melter 3. If we did have to actually go in here and replace it, so it's available, but that's really the last place we want to go. I mean, if we have to, we have to, but that's the last place we want to go.
How large are these cooling panels, man?
What are they?
How large, how big?
This particular one is probably about half the size of it. So the ones on the melter are bigger because it's taller and it's wider. This one's about half the size of this table and maybe 4 feet high.
It's a decent size.
It's decent size, it's not huge, but it's decent size, which means if you had to take it out, you're cutting a decent sized hole. In this, actually, it's more of a rectangle than a hole.
So there were I assume there were multiple lines going through this. It's not a continuous single line through. You would isolate the 1, 2.
I don't think we can isolate the tube, we isolate a collection of tubes. It's more like a supply that supplies multiple tubes on the overall panel itself.
It's a certainty.
So, I mean, my first thought was, and I'm not saying this is what you were thinking about, but my first thought was, oh, we just isolate the valves to that part. Well, it's not quite, there aren't as many valves with a good reason, right? Because if you have less valves,
Maintain them.
well, and less opportunity to take it out of service when you didn't mean to. So, right, that's that two-edge. Today, I'd love to have valves on both ends of that particular line. And then we'd easily be able to say, you can take this one line out of service, no problem. But it's really, oh, if you want to take it out of service, and I'm making it, but it's that panel that I just said. You take all of those lines out of service for the connection that we did. To do that one which by the way, it's this way. That one section, you'd have to go inside and physically just cut it and cap it. Does that help, Bob?
All right. A kind of a policy question. You said the life expectancy of this is 5 years and it will be replaced. Would you anticipate replacing it with the same thing, or are you learning a lesson now that would cause you to have a design that's a little bit more functional?
I say that's premature. The only reason I say that is this cooling system, it's got a lot of moving parts on, a lot of pieces to it. It's functioning on Melter 1 with absolutely no issues. If this is the only one on Melter 2, I mean, I'm not saying we won't consider it, but I don't know that one data point is enough to say we.
So I agree with you there, but if there are other issues discovered.
So one of the things I think it does cause us to have a think about is, okay, accessibility. Does it make sense?
That's where I was going with
to
it.
create some accessibility, and not just maybe the discharge chamber, but does it make sense to have some additional accessibility around the melter itself? And if you've been down there, right, you really only have those little doors to get to the jack bolts.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we put big doors on it, but I think there may be some strategic access points that we would put in place down the road. So one of the things we know for a fact, is that at 5 years, we're gonna take Melter 1 back out of service. Melter 2 probably will be on a 5-year cycle, but if we take Melter 1 out of service and we go evaluate it and decide we can extend the life, it's possible Melter 2 could, and I'm making these numbers up, could go to 6 years.
Yeah.
We know that for DWPF, their life of a melter is longer today than it was when they first started. So we think that's a decent likelihood, but we'll let the actual performance drive that.
Well, you'll learn a lot in the next few years.
I think every day we're learning stuff, and some of them will have a design solution, some of them will have a maintenance solution, and some of them will have the way we operate it solution.
If I'd had a tube leak that had adhesive on it, I wouldn't sleep at night for 5 years. I just wouldn't.
I understand.
And so, I'm concerned about that, and if that's the only thing, then you're probably fine. But I would not lock those designs up early. I'd leave that kind of open.
I understand. I would tell you all the lessons that were, even, let's go back to the end leakage, right? So this whole plug thing, we did not see that, by the way, on Melter 2, so we probably didn't actually need the plug at all. But that's one where, why should we take the risk that we end up having a little bit of a gap between the lid and the sides of the melter? Let's go ahead and we put it in Melter 2. Even though when we tested Melter 2 cold, we don't have the same in leakage problem that we had. It's right near the design, right? There was a margin for the design for in leakage. So you could make the argument why you don't really need that. But this is an easy fix and we ought to just do it because it removes one more vulnerability from the plant. And I think some of them will be designed, some of them, it's just gonna vary. But I think your point, which I agree with completely, is we gotta evaluate each one in turn and figure out what the best solution is for the long term.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a good discussion, I think.
No, hey, no problem. So I apologize. You're gonna listen to me ramble if you ask me questions. I promise they're all the facts as I know
Well, I'm getting paid really well to sit here.
them. Anyways, and I think you can probably tell, right? I have a lot of passion for all the stuff that we're doing, so I do try to understand it as best I can. And I don't have any problem with sharing what I know, because it is, and Suzanne said it, right? There's a lot of exciting things going on.
So you need this going. Badly needed.
So this is Peterson Supply,
Yeah,
manufacturer of the actual melter
yeah, that's
in
correct.
Salt Lake City, yeah, or Ogden. So you've got to worry about potential radiation fields to be able to work on it once it's operating. So are you confident that you can get access to this?
Oh, yeah. For the law facility, yeah.
Yeah, well, right.
So we need to learn things, and that some of these lessons, we'll want to make sure we also plug into HLW.
Yeah.
But yeah, those rates for law facility, that's not problematic at this stage. I mean, even during hot commissioning.
You just struck a note there with the lessons learned. Some of the committee members had put down as an action item is to ask DOE eventually what kind of lessons learned have been transferred from LAW to HLW, and such as the electronic problems we had and et cetera. And yeah, you don't have to talk about it now, but I do believe that people are.
So the entire, what we call the HLW from the foundation team, the whole point of that team was to farm the lessons learned from DF Law and feed them into HLW. Some of those are as big picture as changing from design build to design then build. And some of them are literally the technical stuff that we were just talking about now. Some of them are more the startup and commissioning sequence and what we should be doing for factory acceptance tests versus startup testing versus commissioning, and how you sequence those in a more effective way. So I would just tell you if that's a whole briefing in of itself, and I would recommend you get that on your agenda at some point. And I know Tom Tyner, who works for me, and the HLW team are happy to come and share that whole list.
Okay. Now, is Peterson aware of this leak?
Oh, yeah.
And so in future, we're gonna make a thicker schedule or
I can't tell you the solution right now, but they've been having the dialogue with them. I know that for a fact.
design options? Yeah.
Yeah, I can't tell you the results of that. I know there's been a dialogue. I know there's been a conversation. I know they've been sharing the results of what they've seen out in the facility. So we'll get to that long-term part, but we haven't got there yet.
Thanks, Alana.
Mia, did you have a question?
Yeah, so you mentioned at least for the first melter or melter one, that it'll life expectancy of 5 years. Have you procured additional melters to kind of swap out and?
Yeah,
is
so
that hard to
melter
come by?
3 is, they're actually, the parts are being, fabricated. It's true, but it doesn't seem, because I think of it more of a, either Legos or building blocks. But anyways, that fabrication is already ongoing. Just across the way here over at Atkins is where they'll assemble those melters. So melter 3 is already in progress. I can't give you the date of when melter 3 will be done, but I know that's something that's being worked, and melter 4 has already started. So as I think you all appreciate, that's a multi-year thing to fabricate and build a melter, and then it doesn't get finalized until it's actually out on site. But all the pieces are already in progress. All the contracts are in place. That work is all ongoing.
And is that hard to come by, the parts, and, or is there supply chain issues or anything like
No,
that?
there haven't been any supply chain issues, but it's just this pretty specialized piece of equipment, right? And I know you guys all know that, but. So we haven't had trouble with it. Well, part of that's because we started way ahead to make sure that we could support the need date based upon, now granted, it is not taking into account if something happened to that asset, and I'm not even gonna say that out loud. Right, if something catastrophic happens, we're not in a good place. But we have started the process, but for its projected need date, they're well ahead of that schedule.
So SR now was up to, or the DWPF, it was up to what, 13 years of operation? Their melters?
I don't know the right number. I thought I had heard 8, but that's only from memory.
Yeah.
I know it's well extended over what its original.
Double, at least double, yeah.
So,
And I do believe the refractories put in the WTP, they're a little different because of the makeup of the waste coming in.
yep,
But
that is true.
they are much more resistant to the acid, the corrosion from the glass.
I'm not gonna make any bets, but I think there's a decent probability, it's far greater than zero, that part I can say for sure,
Yeah.
that we'll be able to extend the life over time.
Yeah.
And obviously, we're gonna do that in a deliberate, technically based way, and we're not starting that, probably not even on Melter two, but I have a decent confidence we're gonna get there.
Curiosity, the jack bolts, how much did they expand? Did they?
Not very much.
And so in the design, we were expecting.
I should take that back. There were a couple of areas, I can't remember if it was at the bottom or the top, but on one of those, it actually went to full length, but on the others, it didn't move very much at all. So, so when I say not very much, I don't remember what the number is, but if there's 100 of them, there were only 20 that moved a lot, and the others moved very little. So that's a more complete answer.
And you have a question?
Yes. Early on, I'm aware that there was a lot of interaction with Sellafield and Lahog in terms of lessons learned. Is there still communication?
Yep. And actually, yeah, so we've got a trip out and we'll be consulting with Verano. And there's a trip to both of those facilities over the next year. Those are primarily HLW focused, but that doesn't mean they don't have application to DFLAW as well. So yeah, those relationships continue.
That's good. I've
Yeah.
been able to tour both of them.
Yeah, it's, that's gonna, I believe that'll continue to pay dividends. And not only just for what we gain, I imagine we're gonna probably learn a few things that could be beneficial to them. Not quite yet, but I think we'll get there.
And I think there's a lot of experience now with West Valley as our network, DWPF.
Absolutely.
The 2 European melters. And I understand Korea has got some glass melters going. And so, yeah.
Okay, Bob?
Matt, you mentioned that one of the causes may very well been poor chemistry control of the cooling water. Has anybody looked yet, or plan to look at, where else may have had similar problems?
Yeah, so that, when I talk about the cooling water challenge, that was actually identified more broadly. I don't want to use the word globally because it wasn't in all cases and all things, but more broadly, probably 6 months ago. So there have been, one of the things they took steps to do is, instead of having plant management do all the sampling and work with an outside vendor for all those water chemistry samples, they're actually having the program managed by the lab team, because that's more their expertise. And so they're the ones managing the overall program. Plant management is just execute, and I say just, but they're executing the work, taking the samples, making the adjustments. And bless you, that's a lot more. Because what would happen is plant management doesn't have the same, and part of this is our ongoing path to maturity. They don't have the same sensitivity to a pH problem or a total particulates problem that the lab folks would, because they're chemists. So having them be the ones that are actually managing the adjustments and I mean, it just kind of makes sense. That's their expertise. And the plant management folks, it wasn't. So there were times when, and this obviously we weren't with a hot melter and we weren't, right? This is all pre-heat up where this chemistry problems were really occurring. So we're in a much better place today. Now, that doesn't mean that it created some amount of risk. We're pretty confident it was small, but it wasn't zero. Does that help, Bob?
Yeah, so I guess the bigger look, and you're taking corrective actions, I guess.
Oh, yeah. We actually have a formal water chemistry program now, whereas before it was more of an individual component water chemistry program. Now it's a water chemistry program for all of DFLAW. And on down the road, that'll encompass HLW as well, because as you know, a number of those BOP systems will support HLW equally.
We have just a few more minutes left on this agenda item. Is there anything that needs to be asked before we conclude this? Any concluding statements?
No, thanks, man. I mean, this is great.
No problem.
Come back next, December or something. You have some other great news to share.
I'll give you guys a break, and when you're ready, let me know.
Thank you, Matt.
No problem, thank you.
But what's your employee count out there now?
I can't give you the exact number, but it's just, it's somewhere just over 1,200. But I don't know the exact number. I will tell you, because this is a positive, we went from a high attrition rate of 25% just post-COVID, and now we're back down closer to 10, which is a really, that's significant, right? Because we don't want to be bringing in new people all the time. So, all right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Would you,
We're on break.
I can't believe that water was bad enough to do it.
my suggestion is that we take a 15-minute break, back at 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
For the system plan presentation.
All right, thank you, Josh. We're at a break.
Many times they.
Those that didn't hear online, we're breaking until 2.
Looks like we've got our presenter.
Absolutely, thanks for the reminder.
Thank you very much. All right, so Lindsay, who do we have with us today?
We have a whole crew of folks, so do you guys want to introduce yourselves, everyone who we have here?
Yeah, I can start. My name is Eric Nelson with the Department of Energy. Going to be briefing you all on System Plan 10 today.
John Fleming, Manager Emission Integration Analysis with WRPS. I'll also be briefing you on System Plan 10 today.
It's Karthik Subramanian, I'm the Chief Engineer for WRPS.
And I'm Paul Schroeder, Department of Energy. I'm the Deputy Assistant Manager for Tank Waste Operations. I'm here for Eric's moral support. So.
I'm here to heckle John.
Yeah, they already have.
Just was curious. Okay.
And I'm Alex Kubik, I'm the lead on the system plan. I'm here to help answer questions.
Do you want an introduction from us? You can.
Sure, yeah, please.
My name is Rob Davis, I'm Chair of the committee. Go ahead.
Larry Brandt, I'm at-large member of the committee.
I'm Jacob Reynolds and I know all of these things.
Josh got have facilitation.
Did he tell the facilitation team?
Jim Walls, I'm for ecology.
Pam Larson, I represent Benton County on the hub.
I'm Richard Guy. I'm also Department of Energy, here for moral support. I'm the Director of the Tank Farm Programs Division. Dan McDonald with Ecology. Good to see you.
Ryan Miller with Ecology.
Taylor Page with the Department of Health.
Tom Rogers, Department of Health.
And someone in the back.
Bob Burke, Public at Large.
And yeah.
Mia Berg, Hanford Challenge.
Marianne Waneke, HNIS.
Lindsay Summers, DOE.
Laura Caulfield, Atenex.
All right, so that's everyone in the room, and we have several people with us online. Well, for expediency, already got a list. Got Suzanne Dahl, Dan Solitz, Dave DeSimone, Desiree Henderson, Gabe Bonney, Gary Younger, Matt Hendrickson, Matthew Campbell, Dana McFadden, Steve Needles, Dan Strong, Susan Coleman, and Michael Turner. So who's leading us off on this presentation?
I think I'll be kicking it off, yeah, and then I'll just make some introductory remarks and pass it over to John for some of the bulk presentation. But thanks again for having us here. Again, my name is Eric Nelson, Department of Energy and Tank Farms. Richard, I'm going to be briefing you all on System Plan 10, which we just completed last December. So, and alongside with me on funding, as mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So what we're briefing System Plan 10 is the 10th revision. That's why we call it System Plan 10. Going over really the purpose of the document, the scenarios, what it is, what we modeled within the document itself, and then ultimately the results that came out of that. Purely just informational briefing. I want to keep you all apprised of some of the work we've been doing recently. So just a brief introduction. I'm going to share System Plan.
All right. Thank you. First off, before I dive into these slides, I am aware that some of you in here are intimately familiar with System Plan. Go ahead. However, I do recognize that some of you may not be. So I want to start off with saying, first off, what System Plan isn't, and what it is. So first off, System Plan is not a decision document. What it is a tool, and it's a tool for DOE and ecology to identify mission needs, bottlenecks, risks, and opportunities. It's an opportunity in itself for DOE and ecology to sit down at the table and look at the current technical approach, and understand potential alternatives and evaluate those alternatives to ultimately, hopefully do this better. So 2 years prior to the release of the system plan, DOE and ecology sit down at the table, they look at the requirements and assumption basis for that technical approach, and they propose alternatives and help define the assumption sets that go into those alternatives that ultimately make up the product of the system plan. So for this system plan 10, DOE provided two scenarios. Scenario 1, which is our baseline case, our current technical approach, and alternative scenario 2. Department of Ecology provided 4 additional alternatives, scenarios 3, 4, 5, and 6. And in the following slides, we'll start to get into the assumption sets and the details and the results of those scenarios. But first off, system plan is part of a tri-party agreement milestone, M6240. This milestone requires DOE to submit the system plan to ecology every 3 years by October 31st. For this system plan 10, DOE did request and was granted a 2-month extension to the system plan, and it was delivered to ecology on December 27, 2023. If you want to find the system plan, you can go to the Hanford Administrative Records website, link provided here also in the slides, and just search for Administrative Record 27710. Next slide. All right, so we're going to go through the assumption sets and the cases found in the system plan. First and foremost, what you're looking at here is what we call a scenario run map, and this represents all the cases that actually exist in the product. First and foremost, each block contains sort of a brief description of what that particular case is. For example, scenario 1, baseline case, it also provides the requester. More importantly, what this map does is it lets us know how each of these scenarios are related to each other. So scenario 1, and then relationship to 1A, 1B, scenario 6. So for system plan 10, we evaluated 6 main cases. Scenario 1, the baseline case. Scenario 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In addition to those cases, we also have 5 alternative sensitivity scenarios, and that would be sensitivity 1A, 1B, 3A, 4A, and 5A. Now, the difference between a scenario and a scenario is usually typically a standalone assumption set that differs fairly significantly from any one in particular scenario, whereas sensitivity is really a perturbation on that scenario. So for example, scenario 1 has a funding constraint, and sensitivity scenario 1A removes that funding constraint. Then we can use those to compare each other and look at those results. So what I'm going to do right now is we're going to walk through each one of these, and I'll describe the assumption sets, essentially which define those scenarios. I'm going to start by going through the baseline case, then going to sensitivity scenarios 1A, 1B, then to 6. Then I'll hit this second branch here, talk about 5 and 5A. And then I'll hit this third branch here and talk about 2, 3, and 4. So starting with scenario 1. Scenario 1, the baseline case, is similar to the baseline case that was presented in System Plan 8 and System Plan 9. It entails a full WTP, including a pretreatment facility. With the primary difference here, for System Plan 10, we did introduce an annual funding constraint on that scenario of $2.7 billion per year. And that does have, ultimately does have an effect on the start dates of various facilities in that scenario. In addition, I'd like to point out that the baseline case has a 70% total operating efficiency for the WTP, or the waste treatment plant. And what that really means is that over the course of the mission, we model those facilities at 70% of their design capacity. And you'll hear that a lot as we go through. So off the baseline case, we have 2 sensitivity scenarios. Sensitivity scenario 1A and scenario 1B. On the scenario 1A, here we're simply removing that annual funding constraint Other than that, the scenario is no different than scenario 1. And this particular sensitivity is most similar to the baseline cases we find in system plan 8 and system plan 9. On sensitivity 1B, here we're expediting B complex and T complex retrievals. We're accelerating, specifically accelerating the retrieval of leaking SSDs B109 and T111 to be the retrievals after AFARM retrievals, and that's in around the 2030s. Scenario 1B also is funding constrained at $2.7 billion per year. Moving over to scenario 6. Scenario 6 stands alone in the sense that it was requested by Ecology, whereas scenario 1, 1A, and 1B were requested by DOE. Scenario 6 combines scenario 1A and scenario 1B, uses an unconstrained funding profile, and it expedites the B complex and T complex retrievals. In addition to that, scenario 6 does use simultaneous retrievals in West area, where we retrieve S and SX after AFARM, and then partway through move on to B and T farm retrievals. As a result, scenario 6 does have a fairly aggressive funding profile, basically meaning that there's a lot more money required early on in the mission. Moving on to scenario 5. Scenario 5 is similar to our baseline case, with the exception that we're removing the pretreatment facility and replacing it with a variety of other facilities to replicate that functionality. And those facilities are starting up in the 2030s. Scenario 5 is also unconstrained, and it utilizes a 40% total operating efficiency for the WTB. Scenario 5 does have sensitivity associated with it. And here we're adding new DSTs and evaluating the impact of adding those DSTs on meeting certain or specific SST retrieval milestones. Okay, so now we'll get into our last branch here, 2, 3, and 4, and we'll talk a little bit about scenario 2. In scenario 2, we took a phased startup approach, and what that really looks like is, again, we're removing that pretreatment system and replacing it with a variety of other facilities, similar to the way we did in scenario 5, with the exception that we are now staggering the start of those facilities based on when they're needed in that mission. What that looks like is we start off in the 2020s with a TSCR-like unit in West area, where the waste or where the treated waste from that facility is transported off-site for mobilization and disposal. We then move into a direct feed HOW paradigm in the 2030s, and then finish with the rest of the startup of the facilities in the 2050s. As a note, the facilities that we're discussing here are law supplemental treatment, an HLW effluent management facility, or a high-level waste pretreatment facility, and a law feed evaporator. Also in scenario 2, the law supplemental treatment uses a grouted waste form as opposed to a vitrified waste form found in scenario 1. And we also have an unconstrained funding profile in scenario 2. However, the phased startup approach in scenario 2 does level out the costs, and so we inherently or naturally meet the $2.7 billion constraint that's applied to scenario 1. Also, scenario 2 utilizes a 40% total operating efficiency for the WTB. Moving on to scenario 3. Scenario 3 is similar to scenario 2 with 2 main differences. Here we are accelerating the high-level waste effluent management facility, where we'll start that up in the 2030s. And in addition to that, we are utilizing a vitrified waste form as opposed to the grout waste form used in scenario 2. Moving on to scenario 4. Scenario 4 is similar to scenario 3 with the difference being that here we're expediting B complex and T complex retrievals, similar to the way we did it in scenario 1B up above. Scenarios 3 and 4 both have additional sensitivities. Here we're adding additional DSTs to see how that, whether or not that can accelerate treatment completion and mission completion. All All right, so let's go ahead and move on. On the next slide, we've provided that same information just in a table format for easy lookup. We go ahead and put one more down, we can go into the overall. All right, so first, we just give a little description of this table over here. On the right, we have our scenarios. Over here on the left, we have the year that single cell tank retrieval is complete. We have the year that tank waste treatment completes. We have our unescalated life cycle cost that's in 2023 dollars. And we have our peak annual funding also in 2023 dollars. So first off, overall, looking at the scenarios, we look at the tank waste treatment completion time. First off, we see that most of the scenarios all finish within about a decade of each other, with the earliest being scenario 1A and scenario 6, finishing in 2066 and 2065 respectively, and the longest being the 2, 3, 4 grouping, which is finishing in the mid 2070s, about a decade later. We take a look at single shell tank retrievals when they complete. Looking across the board on the scenarios, we see that all the scenarios essentially finish 5 to 10 years, 5 to 10 years prior to treatment completion. And so when you look at that holistically, and the scenarios finish retrievals and complete treatment all within a decade of each other, you're really driven into a scenario where you're comparing relative achievability in terms of cost. And so you're really looking for the most favorable option with respect to that perspective. Digging down into the scenarios, looking specifically at selected scenarios, we'll start with scenario 1. Again, scenario 1 had the $2.75 or $2.7 billion per year constraint on it, the annual funding constraint. Excuse me. So scenario 1 had the annual funding constraint on it, and when you look at it with respect to scenario 1A, you can make that comparison. And we see that scenario 1 did finish finished our mission approximately 4 years after scenario 1A, and that's primarily due to the fact that that constraint pushes out pre-treatment or the start of pre-treatment, and that cascades through the start of the remaining facilities and ultimately gets realized on the back end during completion with a 4-year delay. It also gets realized with a slight increase in total life cycle cost of $3 billion. Moving on to scenario 2, and we will compare scenario 2 here to scenario 1. First off, we see a 4-year difference between scenario 1 with treatment completion. However, the phased approach in scenario 2 is more palatable from a funding perspective. So we see a much lower life cycle cost at $113 million and a relatively constant peak annual funding. So we didn't have, this is an unconstrained scenario, but we still meet that $2.7 billion funding constraint with scenario 2. What we also see here is while that retrievals is completing and treatment is completing later than scenario 1, they are comparable. And so we can see that a direct feed high level waste scenario can achieve scenario baseline case mission schedule while eliminating the treatment facility and while doing that with a more achievable throughput at 40% TOE. In addition to that, if we look at this from an apples to apples comparison, what we would need to do is look at scenario 1 at 40% TOE. What we would find there is that scenario 1 would actually complete 20 years later. And when you compare scenario 2 to scenario 1 on a same assumption basis, you see that scenario 2 would actually complete 15 years earlier than scenario 1 at a lower life cycle cost and a relatively and roughly the same peak annual funding. Moving on to scenarios 3 and 4. Here, first off, we'd like to point out that scenarios 3 and 4 have a life cycle cost that's higher than relatively higher than the other scenarios, as well as a peak annual funding requirement that's higher than the other scenarios. And that's primarily due to the fact that we're using a vitrified waste form in these scenarios, as opposed to the grout form that we're using in scenario 2. So essentially, what you need is a high capacity law supplemental treatment facility. The construction of that ultimately pushes out treatment, and pushing out treatment, you still have to treat the same amount of waste, now effectively less time, so your costs go up. But we're seeing about a $30 billion difference between scenarios 3 and 4 and scenario 2, and about a $1.5 to $2 billion difference in annual funding requirements between scenarios 3 and 4 and scenario 2. So we go ahead and move on to key results here. Next slide. Next slide. Again, system plan is not a decision document. What it is a tool, and it can help identify mission needs, bottlenecks, risks, and opportunities. And it's an opportunity for DOE and ecology to sit down and discuss the current path forward. Results of these scenarios are generally not considered to be optimistic, and they do not account for historical performances of contracts to the ORP mission. And I think our biggest takeaway from System Plan 10 is that we look at the results of scenario 2, we can see that a direct feed high-level waste scenario can produce similar mission results as the baseline case, but we can do it by eliminating pretreatment, and we can do it at a much more achievable treatment throughput at 40% TOE. And I have a question slide next, but I believe we are going to go to ecology.
Yes, agency perspective.
Yeah.
Some comments and concerns. Thank you for the presentation. We appreciate it. One of the things that I want to bring up to the committee is the fact that within this document, there are a significant number of assumptions, well over 200. And in those assumptions, there are what are called enabling assumptions. There's 48 of them. And what enabling assumptions are is the fill in the blank, if you will. When information is not available or they simply don't know, they make an enabling assumption in order for, Alex, help me if I screw up the terms here. And in order to do the model run and get the model to have an output that makes any sense. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. So in doing so, keep in mind that those enabling assumptions, in addition to that, there's over 300 other assumptions in there. The reason I bring this up is that this is the best that we have at the time we did this. If anyone were to ask if any of these are truth, my answer would be, well, it depends. It depends on what it is you want to do and where you want to go. Now, speaking to the assumptions, particularly involved in number 2, what you haven't heard so far is the fact that number 2 is a replication of alternative 18 in the AOA space. What is different about this one is the fact that the foundational baseline at the time the AOA was done is different than the foundational baseline done in here. Therefore, you will see somewhat different answers, and it's noted in the particular document. All of that having been said, it's quite important when you get into each of the assumption sets and criteria to make sure you understand that those are what are driving the outputs, and all you have to do is change 1 or 2 assumptions and the output could change. Alec has schooled us quite often in the idea that, hey, this particular assumption doesn't work well, you need to change this, or I can't do this criteria because the model won't take it. Variety of those kinds of things in order to do what I call smoothing, to make sure all this stuff works. Will any or all of these works? Well, again, it depends. What do you want? What are your priorities? It's a valuable effort, but as has been said, it is just a tool. It's not a decision tool. I would draw your attention to 2 charts in this particular document. You'll find them in all of them. It's ES3, which is key scenario inputs and assumptions, and ES4, which is comparison of key results. It expands upon the information that you've already seen here, and it gives you a good amount of information on the various pieces and parts involved in the life cycle. And the reason I bring that up, one of the things that we in DOE did when we put together this scenario set, and we've done it in many of them, Alec again was sitting at the table schooling us when we did it. We put together what it is we thought we wanted to have in a scenario. Those were all agreed to. And then those were signed off by senior DOE management and senior ecology management. That was, if you will, the approval and the okay to run the scenario sets that you're seeing in this. That's been done each and every time. So it's not something that either DOE came up with or ecology came up with. This was agreed to collaboratively and taken to senior management. And what you're seeing here is the result of that agreement at that particular level. Going further, when you take a look at things, please understand that any scenario you choose, there are give and gets. You don't get something for nothing. As you go through and you look at the text in each of the scenarios, you'll see a variety of here's what it means, here's what you give up, here's what needs to change. You'll also see cost profiles, and you'll also see risk profiles. Pay attention to those because those are all involved in making a cogent decision on how it is we're going to proceed. Jeff?
I only had just one, I'm with ecology too, and I'm from the pink ones. Just to point out, one of the last summary points is that this is a very optimistic projection. So when you look at these dates, keep that in mind. So if you think they're too long, they're probably going to get longer. So just keep, that's the only thing I wanted to just highlight today. We did do a lot of work to address some leaking tanks and their scenarios to address that, but I think Dan pointed you to some good places to think about how that plays in your thinking of any advice or anything that you do for that. So that's all I had to add.
Suzanne, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so I guess the only thing I would add, I agree with what both Jeff and Dan said, and I did want to caution us in looking at any of the alternatives that look at grout as a scenario. Certainly it's a scenario to be considered, and that's what the whole point of the system plan is, but there's not agreement on ecology's part that grout is an acceptable waste form to be disposed of at the integrated disposal landfill, because we have various risk assessments that show us that it's not protective of groundwater. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this scenario or that scenario is not a useful piece of information, because they are in their own right, but they also could be considered that grout could go for offsite disposal as well. So just wanted to be clear about that.
All right. Think with that covered, we're ready to move to committee discussion.
Any other presentation issues want to bring up? Okay. Well, yeah. So I've had a chance to look at this for a little while, and some of the questions that I have now, again, this is a long-term study. I didn't see any plus or minuses, and I guess those are bound in the assumptions. You know, some sort of a variance that's bound in the assumptions. And one of the things that I am the most fearful about is the rest of our infrastructure that we're depending upon to implement any of these system plans. And there's a number of new buildings that also need to be made and built. And so maybe you could speak to that, you know, essentially, I see one of the big, as far as the infrastructure goes, I think a cross-site transfer is a big hit. Because it's not to code. When it was built many years ago, it wouldn't build it, design it the same way now as it was in the past. And, you know, it's just a very, I think that's a big limiting factor, going waste over from the two farms. Maybe one could speak to that if you want, but, you know, granted, this is a system plan. It's like, it's not a lot of criticism to be made of it because it's a great effort on it, but it should help us identify the weaknesses and then maybe talk about it. So that's essentially my view so far. Again, it's a huge document. It's very meaty. I like the way it's presented. I think the introduction, I advise everybody to go take a look at the very beginning because it describes all the facilities as well as the future facilities that need to be built to accomplish these goals. So anybody else in the room want to talk on that? Go ahead. Questions, anybody?
So for questions, I believe, Dan.
He's asking if they have a response to his question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on the infrastructure piece, absolutely, as you read through the system plan too, they lay out, a lot of the new infrastructure that we've got coming online, some of the existing infrastructure that you spoke to, when the need by dates are for that as well. And the assumptions that have gone into, what it's gonna take to go get that in place so that we have those capabilities when we need them to go progress the mission for those individual scenarios. So it's definitely a consideration, looking at, the life service facilities, like bringing on that here high-level waste effluent management facility type situation, looking at that and its capabilities and when we'll need that in the mission to help supplement an HLW. All of that is, definitely, it's a good point, but it's something that we try to take into consideration with the best available knowledge we have today on. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Only that they represent a starting point, and there's a lot of other work that goes.
Could you speak up so people on the
Sorry.
phone can hear? Sorry.
Only that this represents a starting point, and moving further beyond that, there's a lot more work, a lot more investigation, a lot more effort that go into solidifying the plan as it moves into the near term. So a lot of what I heard you talking about, happens, and it may not be directly captured in the system plan, but does happen.
Okay.
That's what I understand.
Okay, so, Karthik, maybe you could answer this one. I know we have a huge program on our tanks, and we've done really excellent jobs exploring, looking at them, validating somewhat of their integrity. But have we equally done that to the other parts of the infrastructure? And what would you think the most limiting thing that we ought to focus some attention to?
Way to call me out, Rob. So I think two things. One, not only do the tanks, but we have a pretty extensive transfer line integrity program. We also have, just as part of the way that we execute any Department of Energy facility as maintenance, preventive maintenance, and we identify all the critical, we identify all the engineering requirements to meet their functions. And then we do the maintenance and the surveillance in order to meet those functions. And then when we identify that it is my words, end of life for those, and we identify a replacement schedule. So the tank farms over the last probably 5 to 10 years has recognized the need to, probably 10 years now, to really invest a lot in the infrastructure. Not only in maintaining the current infrastructure and being more detailed and, inspections and taking the pressure test, but also recognize the need to build new infrastructure or replace electrical systems. And so we're going through that entire program right now. And that's a huge effort with the investment the department has made there. That's going to be the enabler for making any of these things happen. And you mentioned the cross-site specifically. The cross-site, so there's an entire, the need date is identified by the system plan as a planning tool. When that is identified, then we enter into the engineering realm and say, okay, what do we have to do to qualify the cross-site transfer line? Just like any other piece of equipment would have to be qualified, and we're identifying those tests that need to be done.
And Karthik, if I can follow up on that, can we allow Ryan to share just a bit? I want to answer your question about cross-site transfer line. Okay, what you're going to see, this is what's called a proposed scenario sheet. It is condensed by scenario, and then senior management of DOE and senior management of ecology approved this. In the DST operations section, 1, 2, 3, about 5 or 6 bullets down, you'll see that the supernate and slurry line cross-site transfer lines are being considered. Depending on the scenario, they're either in or they're out, or there's some combination. And it just depends on the agreement posed at the time each of the scenarios was built. In this particular case, if that particular scenario is the one that's chosen for action going forward, then folks in Karthik's shop and our shop and everybody else recognizes that that is now, if you will, real, and it's something that has to be put into the mix for getting things going forward. But in the system plan venue, this is how we deal with it. When you look at the scenarios, and you may have to go into the text, Rob, you may have gotten that far, you may have not. You'll find indications of either cross-site transfer lines in or cross-site transfer lines out, and what the impact of that particular decision is on that scenario.
Rob, I think I would also add to, at least when I think of infrastructure, I think of like a little eye and a big eye. And, you know, I think what we're talking about in here is kind of the little eye is what's the infrastructure needed to support the tank waste operations piece, but you also have the big eye, which is the site infrastructure that's needed to support the entire site. And just recognize that the contractor, HMIS in particular, is the lead on that, and they are always continuously working on with the other contractors to evaluate what upgrades they need, and when they need them to support the broader mission. And that really kind of happens, I think, outside of this system plan and dialogue, but that is on the radar screen.
Okay. Paul is great, and so is Karthik about being straight man for me. As far as infrastructure is concerned in a tank farm, let's talk about the waste receiving facilities or waste receiving facilities. Depending on the scenario chosen and the timing of need, you'll find information in that system plan about waste receipt facilities or waste receiving facilities, not only when they're needed, but why and approximate cost of those. So that level of indication by tank farm is in there.
So you're suggesting then that, say a scenario comes true, then we would be several years in advance knowing that we need to refurbish or build or do something to that.
I would back away from the word no. What I would offer is we could be time ahead of considering the particular need. And if in fact that need is part of a chosen solution set for life cycle process control strategies, then yeah, that would come into the mix. But to say we would know ahead of time based on the particular scenario chosen, I think that's a little premature at this point. Because again, this is not a decision tool. This is just, if you will, what ifs.
So we have a small queue. Anybody else online? So quick review with you. We got Dan Solitz online, Matt Henderson online, now Pam in the room. Anyone else like that? Bob Quirk. Dan, question.
Well, a question and a comment and an appreciation of the Department of Energy pushing forward into high level waste disposal. I was glad to see in this system plan that there was a date associated with when that stuff might be moving off the site into deep geologic disposal. But there was also a lot of talk about double stacking, which the immobilized high level waste, which is what Savannah River is doing now. I think in the general political environment in the next few years, I'm hoping that will open up. I know that the Department of Energy is holding seminars on high level waste disposal for alternative reactors. I'm wondering if it wouldn't be beneficial to start talking about. I'm going into the bedroom to get my phone here. Start talking about whether or not it's wise to commingle the commercial reactor waste with the weapons waste. It might be smarter and quicker to not do that. I mean, you're talking about the 60, 70 years out before a hole in the ground is found for this stuff. And hopefully, you know, I'm glad that we're talking about it now. I'm glad to see those numbers in this system plan. But as we go forward, we need to bring that date sooner rather than later, because there's a lot of time, effort, and money just to store that stuff, because it's going someplace else anyway. And there's also other secondary wastes that are high level waste that it might be simplified if there were a home for those, that you would have to figure out how to grind them up and put them back into the high level waste. So anyway, those are my comments, and then I also want to show my appreciation for the Department of Energy actually starting to talk about deep geologic disposal again. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for your comment, Matt.
Well, I have several as well here. Now, I remember the AOA being very much involved with, well, what kind of pretreatment is going to be needed, what kind of waste characterization facilities are going to be needed. One thing I noticed with scenario 2 is it kind of, the pretreatment facility isn't really included. One, I was kind of wondering about where the caustic leaching will be done in number 2. That's one question. Also, is there any additional evaporator capacity added in that scenario? Number 2, I like the fact that Dan addressed the WRFs, especially there in B&T farms. What is the, I like having that additional capacity very, very much. More tank volume is a good thing in my book. But can that support farms beyond B&T? That capacity once those recoveries are done. I believe B's WRF under scenario 2 at least is slated to come online in 2050. That's number 2. Number 3, just a general suggestion for the future. Maybe we address this in an IM team through this committee. But I would certainly like, earlier you talked about comparing apples to apples. When you have multiple scenarios with multiple TOEs, efficiencies, the 40 versus 70, it made it very difficult to do that apples to apples comparison, which, I've been working on. I've got several lines written down, but I think that's those are some of the big ones for now.
So I think the first one is, how do the scenarios factor in additional pretreatment, waste characterization, or other facilities like evaporator capacity? Is that a fair recap?
That's fair. I remember the AOA, and since scenario 2 is based off of scenario 18 from the AOA, much of the AOA was addressing how this waste is going to be treated, what kind of pretreatment it'll need. So I'd really like to know under scenario 2 where the caustic leaching is going to be done in particular, since there's no pretreatment plant scheduled for that.
Yeah, I can answer that question. So scenario 2 is exactly the same as AOA 18 in that regard. The AOA went more into detail on those facilities because that's more in line with the purpose of the AOA versus the system plan. But in scenario 2, it's the same as AOA 18. We're not doing cost leaching high waste feed until 2050 when we get our high waste feed preparation facility online. And then after that, there is caustic leaching. So a fraction of the waste is treated with just washing, no leaching, and then we get leaching later on. And there's also 2 new evaporators that come online around that same time period. One will be concentrating the waste is processed through TISCR and AMPS, so that's more concentrated for treatment. And then a second evaporator would be a high waste effluent management facility that'd be concentrating the effluents from the high waste process. So there's less impact in tank space from those. Does that answer your question on that?
That helps with the first question. How about those WRFs? Or do they add capacity beyond the B&T farms when they come online?
Well, it's really the B&T complexes. So, B, BXBY, TTXBY. And those are the last repeals completed in this scenario. So you wouldn't need the work to go after SS, X, and U because those repeals are completed before you even have the T work available. Hypothetically, if you did need to use that tank space for some other reason, like if you had like a DST leak, you could need that space will be available for that purpose as well.
Okay. That answer everything you had, Matt?
Yeah, yes, for now. Well, one thing I would like to hear addressed from the tri-party agencies is, I understand this is not a decision document. How do they envision the tank waste committee giving advice? It's, no advice was solicited. How do they imagine us interacting on these particular scenarios for, say, System Plan 11 when it comes up?
Good question. Rob, can I start with that one?
Sure.
What I would offer is this. Over the time period of the TPA and then PAB and all of that, there have been a minimum of 5
pieces of advice that have come out from the HAB on this particular subject. The HAB at any time is certainly free, and we encourage and welcome it to provide advice on things relative to the system plan. In addition to that, over time, and I go back to when Jim Lynch was involved with this, Jim Lynch and I, and Jeff and I have sat with the HAB as necessary and talked about the kinds of things that we're considering. We've talked about the various pieces and parts of the life cycle process that we believe are appropriate to exercise and test within the system plan. So there is that relationship. And I welcome HAB's advice on what to consider in terms of scenarios. I welcome the HAB's advice on what we need to caution ourselves on in building these scenarios. Please feel free to do that anytime. Matt, does that help on that order?
Yes, thank you. I was just considering whether we were going to start an IM team on this type of issue for System Plan 11 in particular or not. So that'll come up later.
Well, keep in mind that the system plan, as noted in the tri-party agreement, is every 3 years. So we just got this one at the end of 23. So what you're suggesting is a very good thing. What I would offer is you're probably a year too early at this point.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.
I just want to see USDV, did you have any thoughts on Matt's question? I just want to make sure that we weren't.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, it's, you know, the way I would see the HAB and the tank waste committee, it would be not so much providing, technical advice or recommendations, but more so just, policy level, recommendations and advice, would certainly be valuable. And as Dan said, you know, probably as we get a little closer, to the next one, we'll be better positioned to do that.
I think there was one more piece to Matt's question too, I didn't get to address. He asked about it being difficult to compare scenario one to other scenarios, the TOE difference. And so we were not requested to run a 4% TOE sensitivity as one of the scenarios for System Plan 10. But if you look in the executive summary and description of the baseline case, as well as in the main report in section 5, we do give the mission completion dates for that possible sensitivity. So you'd be looking at retrieval completion of 2074 and mission completion of 2094 if you were to use that lower TOE for the baseline case.
Can I add a little bit to what Dan said, or even Paul? Again, I'm Jeff from ecology as well. One of the things that I think of the HAB as is kind of representing the public and other interested parties. And when I look at the system plan, like I said, it's an optimistic document. And I was reflecting about when we're going to end the mission, and then if this is today, how far back we would love to say this is equivalent. So if you think about 1980 to now is how far we went, and we're saying now is from now until 2060, we'll be doing this work. And I think the thought process, like Paul was saying, is, you know, what kind of policy issues do you see as important here? So looking at how they design these scenarios and how we put the pieces together, like we have leaking tanks one, we have the baseline one, we have this high level waste acceleration or direct feed. And does that all make sense to you? And Rob brought up a great point, because that's the point that bears on me a lot, is these single shell tanks built in 40s, 50s, 60s. They're going to be holding waste, 100 to 150, maybe 200 years, considering how optimistic this scenario is. And so, I've been with SSDs for a really long time, and it just weighs on me. I don't know what to do with it, but they're old tanks holding waste, and we're going to go in and retrieve these tanks. That's the hope. And well, are we making the right choices? And so I don't want to leave any more than that. Just like Paul said, it's a policy thought process. So I'd encourage you. This system plan is as good as any, because they always change and they always project stuff. And so are we making the right choices today? And even, did you like the scenarios we like? Because if we're going to do another one, it wouldn't hurt to know what you thought, what kind of scenarios we would consider. I think, it's always us and DOE sit down and talk about scenarios, but if we hear from you, we know what you're thinking. And so I would just encourage you to contemplate, are we kind of looking at the right stuff and are we making, what do you lean to as a board?
Jeff, I think you framed that really well. And, it's the, from the public perspective, what are the policies, what are the decisions, are they, right? Is this an acceptable outcome? You saw several examples there where, we ranged from $2.7 billion to $4.7 billion and we were, our timeframe, varied significantly. So hearing, the haves input, our perspective on the bottom line stuff would be helpful.
And I would offer, going back to the advice that the have has given to us up to this point, those 5 or 6 specifics that I can tell you about, I looked through them very recently just to remember what was in those, and much of the information that was suggested by the have has to a greater or lesser degree been incorporated in these system plans.
I think, let me interrupt our question here. The other things that I see here that I gotta ask a question is we've had reports from the FRDC, we've had GAO reports, one in 23, basically says DOE should validate the analysis of high-level waste. I mean, that's a big effort. I didn't see that in here. Okay, or those kind of efforts. But, in the end, that waste is gonna be out there for longer than all of our lives. And we're gonna be passing it on. And I'd like to know how the system plan is factoring in the decisions being made now, for example, for our 5-year plan. And are these all furthering one or more of those scenarios? And the second thing is that eventually, don't you think that we would narrow down to one scenario, one plan, focusing on that and I'm a dreamer, that's right. But I would think that we would like to maybe see less scenarios and more concrete information in the future, especially when it comes to the Savannah River reports, the GAO reports, the other stuff, because what that does is it just adds confusion to it and validate what to do with high-level waste. Well, what part of the validation do they want us to do? How we're gonna put it in an immobilized state, okay? Or, for the longest time, we've all assumed we have to remove, treat, and dispose. Remove it from the tanks, treat it and immobilize that waste, and then dispose it in a geologic repository, as stated in the Waste Policy Act of 1982. So, yeah, that's not here. That's all.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that is, first of all, I think what you'll see, and we kind of tiptoed around it a little bit, but the Alt 18 and the high-level waste AOA is consistent with the FFRDC and the National Academy of Science. For the purpose of this presentation, we wanted to put it basically a circle about, what did we evaluate and what are the results, recognizing that the timing is probably premature to have those discussions with what's going on between holistic negotiations, which is ongoing, and then even the practicability evaluation that was included in the system plan 10, recognize that we put that in, but there's still ongoing discussions with ecology on what that document needs to be shaped or how it needs to be shaped. And so really that's what we intended to do right here, is just, let's talk about what we can clearly talk about for the purpose, but going forward, I think the recommendation is solid.
Yeah, if I could make just one additional comment too on the number of scenarios and the narrowing down of them, I think too. One of the reasons we do the system plan every 3 years is really to just take a step back and look at the mission as a whole, look at what technological opportunities may exist that we weren't aware of even 3 years ago. I mean, we're living in a world now where it's progressing so much faster, and it gives us the opportunity to take that step back and look at the inputs, both on a larger system plan level as well as on a technical level, and understand maybe where the efficiencies can be realized based on new available information. FFRDC report's a great example of that in terms of we were able to go through that process and get some really great input that allowed us to then take that step back again and say, okay, let's look at the broader picture here. So I hear what you're saying in terms of narrowing it down, but it's also gives us the opportunity to take a step back and look at the big picture.
Right. Well, I think that this particularly would identify certain things that we didn't see in the past. Things like the 51 non-contaminated but non-waste bearing tanks and things of that sort. That what are we going to do with those? And so, you know, I'm glad that I liked it. I really did. I really liked it. I liked the format. I liked the beginning explanation of all the facilities and future facilities. So far I have no complaints. It's just that we, as a board, would like to know how this fits in the decision-making from year to year or in the 5-year plan. And believe me, I believe we have got the best chance of solving these problems now than we've ever had. So I think it's a great effort. It certainly exposes a lot of things that brings back to mind to me that maybe I knew about it once, but I forgot about it. And the site's huge. Please, let's continue with the comments.
Note that Suzanne dropped off the chat, but she offered a clarification. Back. Suzanne, would you like to offer your clarification?
Yeah, so, the high level waste treatment of vitrification and the disposal in deep geologic location, wherever that turns out to be, is decided and is documented. It's in the current TPA in certain specific milestones, and it's in the Tours EIS record of decision and the tank and the subsequent tank closure waste management environmental EIS, the EIS record of decision. So now, how much pre-treatment needs to happen and what the timing of that will be, and would we do direct feed high level for a while? Those are all sort of questions that are being looked at in the system plan in addition to some other questions, but those other decisions have been made.
Thank you. So as a reminder, a queue of Pam and then Bob. So everyone else would like to be in, please flag me down. Pam, thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you. So I've been retired for 4 years and acronyms are kind of leaking out of my brain. So let me try and pose what I want to raise. So first of all, Rob, would you define what FFRDC is? Because it keeps getting mentioned.
Yeah, that's the federally funded research program.
Okay, and that is different than what the National Academies did, or if
Yes, different than the National Academy.
Okay, so from my role, we've got to be able to get the money to get this done. Okay, and so are you thinking about the authorization committees in Congress, the appropriation committees in Congress and OMB? Are you briefing them? And first of all, it's going to be a big challenge for them to look at this in terms of the technical analysis. That's who's got to believe it. Are you talking to them? No?
Yeah, I think there's always, and maybe not so much at the site level, but at the department level, there are always those discussions going on.
Then you need to educate headquarters.
And we do.
And you do.
And we do.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a lot of discussion with headquarters, and we're usually always synced up pretty tightly so that they can be positioned well enough to have those discussions on the Hill and with the other agencies as well.
Okay. So over the years, as the National Academies did 1 and 2, and for me, the beginning of 3, I testified on behalf of the community. And they were appointed because Congress wanted to figure out a realistic funding of what it's going to take to clean up Hanford. First analysis, yeah, they put some paper together, no recommendation. Second analysis, no recommendation. Third analysis, they're warming up the grout. But we still have some questions about that. And in sitting through the meetings, what made me nuts is that the Savannah River site was hired to do the analysis and to teach these people what's going on, and they were terrible. They were absolutely awful, and they would not get through their heads that this is not a traditional system plan. The system plan, and I'm not an engineer, but the sense is, okay, what do we got? Where are we going? How are we gonna get there? That's a system plan. This is not that kind of a plan. And they kept telling the committee, referencing the system plan as a traditional system plan and saying that this is what Hanford is gonna do and this is what the analysis is. If you have to go through that process again, please inform Savannah River how this works so they won't damage the analysis by presenting false information about what you guys do. So that's my 2 cents. So hopefully there's some value in that, but it takes so much of your time. Every time everything has to be analyzed externally, and you know, be concise, help them give us a positive recommendation as opposed to give them more money to study us, which I think is a waste of money. Anyway, thank you.
No, I appreciate the perspective, and, you know, one of the things about that whole team was they intentionally wanted to staff up, you know, an independent review, and so with that, you get an independent review, which is not always 100% consistent.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Just a real simple question. I think it's simple. The unassociated life cycle cost and peak annual funding cost. Is that just for the waste treatment plant? Is that for waste treatment plant and tank farm fuels? Is it all of ORP work? Is it all of Hanford work? What is that number?
So that number specifically is for the waste treatment mission. So that's looking at the tank farms and then operation of the WTP facility.
Okay, yeah. So retrieving the waste, getting the WTP, getting it treated.
Yes.
It's all over P scope, not the RLC.
Right,
Yes.
all our ORP, right? You know, and someday there will only be one.
But the funding requirement, was that just for accomplishing the system plan and not operating WTP?
It includes operations.
That's what I thought. Okay. So it's a site-wide budget.
Well,
No, it's not. It's just ORP only.
To Bob's question, you know, this covers the scenarios, but it doesn't, acknowledge maybe the other activities on the Hanford site, you know, like the RL activities that are being done. So you can see by the numbers, 2.7 is our bottom line. You know, that's about what we spend collectively for the site, right? So those are big tickets, right?
Rob, one of the ways that it might be helpful for you to understand what is included and what isn't, if you go to those 2 charts that I cited, you'll see a list on the left-hand side of all of the so-called included factors that are outlined in the system plan.
Okay.
So, are there any other questions while we have our presenters available? Nothing online. If you would like to join, feel free to raise your hand or speak up.
Well, I want to thank you, folks. Appreciate it. I know it's a hard work, hard all. Very good. And I hope Lindsay was pretty soft on it. Stiff on it. But it's something that I really encourage her to make sure that we get this briefing. And I'll report to the main board at our next board meeting that it was a good discussion and we should go forward.
Yeah, this was, at least from my perspective, this has been a really good collaborative effort with ecology and with the WRPS and the department. Have really spent a lot of hours. You can imagine how detailed these scenarios are, just complexity. It didn't just happen.
So when we get our next 5-year plan, because it's gonna reflect more current cost estimates to accomplish the 5-year scope. Would this then change the future system plans? Probably.
Sorry, so you're asking, when we have the 5-year mission defined, is that gonna feed into system plan 11? Is that the question?
Yeah, well, I don't really can't pull it real quick here, but when Brian showed up and showed us this 5-year plan on our sheet.
Placemats.
Yeah, you know, I really liked it because it really scoped out a bigger picture. Excuse me. But, the question is we're gonna see cost escalations in anything 5 years from now. And that will then have to be figured into the next system plan. Right, okay. And then this, congratulations, by the way, on settling the contract. You know, a 10-year contract, and we're gonna have some stability out there. $45 billion, 47. It's a huge amount of money.
Well, thank you, the DOE contractor and ecology staff. Josh?
Larry, I have one light question. In one of the scenarios, you, proposed adding some DSTs. Have you, since the single shells are gonna be 100 years old, but by some of these scenarios, have you, contemplated repair or replacement or, alternatives to those tanks that are leaking or split by an earthquake or something of that sort?
So I mean, I can give you my perspective is that, rather than trying to repair, you know, aging tanks, I would rather spend that, you've got a finite amount of funds. So I'd rather apply those funds to actually retreatment.
I actually misspoke. You can't repair those, right? But does that, have you figured any cost in here for replacing either with double shells or single shells beyond that one scenario? We looked at, was it 5 or 6?
There's a couple sensitivity cases.
Was it?
There were sensitivity cases where we looked at adding new double shell tanks, but those weren't replacing ones that failed, those were additional ones. In addition to 27 tank monitoring.
Okay. So from a policy point of view, if we sent you an email in a year and a half and said we would like to have you reconsider that, that would fit into your shoebox.
We did look at it in System Plan 9, so scenario 5 in System Plan 9. We looked at the impact of, I think it was 5 additional failed DSTs. And we didn't see a lot of impact from that, to be honest.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I'll just say
I'd like to
too,
follow up with that.
yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
One of the things that I think will help in the answer to your question is they don't expect to replace any DSTs.
Right.
So they're gonna operate with 27 now, and if one fails, they're gonna deal with it. That's the plan right now. And by the way, you know, me and my dark cloud now,
Well,
all the DSTs are full, you know, I mean.
I thought it was supposed to be an empty room.
There's a total of one empty one and 27 tanks. And Paul knows better how to explain the 27 tank thing.
Glad you guys are full of bad news.
I can do any better, you know, I'm the worst here, so trust me, take my thoughts with a grain of salt.
Well, I'm an engineer, so I always think ahead about potential failures, and it just looks like you guys have a roadblock in case you have some kind of an accident or some accelerated aging or some pitting or something of that sort. You know, as an engineering perspective, I don't like that very well, but I know what the costs are gonna be to fix that. And you guys are weighing cost against pollution or maybe even human health. And so that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
So on the infrastructure piece, I think the card that you mentioned earlier too, we do operate that tank integrity program. And, you know, we recognize, right, the DSTs those are our operational fleet. That's, you know, everything you saw up here for the waste treatment plant, everything goes through the DST system, right? So there's a lot of time and money that we spend going into investigating the integrity of those tanks, as well as developing technologies to help promote, promote their operational usefulness to us. I think one example of that is, when I was here last, January, I mentioned it, but we're looking at DST refurbishment technologies to actually mitigate some of the corrosion that we're seeing in the tanks.
Yeah.
Come back and make sure that these things don't have the issues like I talked about earlier, don't leak, and really try to buy down that risk ultimately.
And like Paul alluded to earlier, really the key is to start treating the waste. Because when you treat the waste, you create more space in the double shell tanks. You can accommodate further tank failures. They do happen. People are trying hard to make sure they don't happen.
Well, and because of that, I would think that you guys would wander toward one of these scenarios that was a little faster, that they got to the end line sooner. Because you're still talking about 100-year-old tanks in a lot of cases.
Or acceleration of HLW. Instead of 2033, make it 2030. And yet the costs are gonna, the next few years' costs would be very high. But that would be a consideration.
There you go. You guys are getting some advice together.
I'd like to offer one more point on the failed DSTs. We took a very hard look at the DSTs as we know them today. And one of our engineers did an assessment and chose 5 based on age, use, present condition, all of the pieces and parts that we can know about. In addition to that, he staggered them every 5 years, so it's not just happenstance. He built a protocol for this particular scenario based on certain tanks failing at certain times, hence. So we could take a look at the impacts of it that way. So
I'd be a lot more comfortable recommending to this group that that's what's being implemented or some version of that. At least you're seeing these things knocked out, on occasion, rather than have one get to be 110 years old. I'm talking about single shell, not double shell.
That scenario Dan spoke to was just simply not scenario 5.
There's a lot of single shell in here.
Did you say you were interested in single shells or double shells?
Well, single shell because of the age, but double shells would fail too.
Well, yeah, and that goes to some of the scenarios that we looked at. We've got potential of leaking tanks, leaking SSTs. There's about 2.5 million gallons of liquid in the tanks now, and that can leak out of the drain. And so look at the scenarios. That's one way of thinking about through what we do about SSTs and the condition of the SSTs. And that was highlighting the fact that, it's another 1980 to now is about what we're looking at as an optimistic date for finishing the mission. And that's a lot of years sitting in it. And I want to add one more thing that I've always appreciated about the OE is they do have a really good, robust integrity plan for the DSTs. They look at them in all the ways that they could, and they look at new ways of looking at them. And then I'll add a little comma. They don't predict failures. And so when they had the loss of AY 102, that was not an integrity assessment defined scenario. I mean, it was what they could look at, looked okay. And they can look at about 3 to 5% of the tank when they do their inspections, and they're improving that. But anyway, I do want to plug that they do have a good integrity assessment, as good as it's going to get with the tanks we have.
I think the oldest tanks we have is in T Farm, 1943. When it was built.
Well, they are retrieved. Hallelujah for that.
Got just a couple of minutes left. Is there anything we said to conclude this item?
No, just a big thank you to our presenters.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all very much for your time.
Okay. Take a break, Josh, for 5 minutes, then reconvene. Okay.
Brad, would you like to take a 5-minute break?
Thanks,
All
Ryan.
right, we're muted. We are reconvening. We are to the meeting business.
Lost half the room. I know, we had like such a good trip.
Maybe it's clustered right here. Rob, can you give us an overview of where we are for committee elections?
Committee elections. So I've asked, I would like to self-nominate myself. And as chair, Rob Parmalee has told me that he can't participate where he's too busy on WTP. He's been on some Tiger Team type things that has to take a lot of his time. So, and Chris Sutton had volunteered to be the vice chair. And so unless there's anybody else that'd like to nominate or nominate themselves, I think that maybe we could go ahead and vote today and be done with it.
So there was a proposal at the executive steering committee that you can choose, we can I choose when the committee elects, but the idea is that those election terms will take place October 1st, running through the next fiscal year. And is that the option?
The terms, right.
So your preference is to elect today to start October 1st, right?
Right.
All right.
If everybody's okay with that.
And so do we have any other nominations for chair of this committee? Does the committee agree with Rob continuing his term as of October 1st?
Are there any objections? It's clear to do it that way. Are there any objections to Rob continuing to serve as chair with the new term to begin October 1st? Please voice any objections now if we have them.
And that will probably be my last year on the board. Probably, unless something can happen.
I hear silence. It is a celebratory silence.
Congratulations, Rob.
Never asked me another year. How painful.
You're welcome. For you or for me? Just kidding.
You.
Feel so lonely over here.
And do we have any other nominations for vice chair of this committee?
Now, the reason why Chris is not here right now is he's on a cruise boat, I believe in the Mediterranean somewhere.
Well, where are his priorities?
On the boat.
I'm not gonna say it. But yeah, Chris has, he has actually gone through a little bit more of the system plan than I have. And so a couple of our discussions were, he's wondering about, he brought up the issues about the canister count for high level waste changing and those kind of things. So like I said, he's probably more into those kind of numbers than I looked at, but the dates scare me, I mean, 2080. I mean, to do that and to expect the infrastructure to handle there does anybody, it bothers me that, we haven't really considered the environmental damage if we did have a big leak. Because that would take a huge amount of budget to clean up something that happened. And I know we're kind of immune from earthquakes, we're kind of immune from a lot of the stuff, dry climate, and we got a good inspection program and things, but things can happen, and I don't know how prepared we are for that.
So before we explore that too far, I did want to confirm there are no other nominations for TWST vice chair. Does the committee agree with Chris Sutton serving as the TWST vice chair starting? Are there any objections to Chris Sutton serving as vice chair starting October 1st?
And just to confirm, can Rob Parmalee continue to serve to October? Does he need to?
Oh, sure. So yeah, he's gonna pay attention to some of the stuff, and I'll give him a phone call, let him know that he's off the hook next year. But
I have seen or heard no objections, so Chris Sutton will serve. We will congratulate him the next time we see him.
And he'll be invited to the leadership workshop in June?
Yes, I think that is the agreement.
Yep. Okay. Absolutely.
Right. So it's my understanding that at the February board meeting, you proposed the idea of starting a system plan 10 work group or IM team. Do you have an idea of how you want that to move forward?
well, let's the people, what subjects Well, I think it's maybe might be too early for some of the folks, because now they first learn about the system plan. And now hopefully they'll go look it up. It's on Google, system plan, DOE Hanford, and it'll come right up.
Yeah, it's also linked in the slide deck, which is currently available online.
And in Hanford, or had happenings, I think a week or so ago. Anyway, yeah.
The police guy said that it would be more effective to, approach them a year ahead. So maybe you don't do that for a while.
System plan 11, right?
Yeah, here's my thought on that though, is that, he would be right if the HAB was able to put out advice in a timely manner, but it can't, advice takes a year after we first talked about it to get out. And so advice a year from now means that you start in June, right? Yeah. And I also suspect there's some things that may not be system plan specific, and perhaps when I say this, I'm putting too broad a scope on the system plan IMT, but there's a lot of things that are system plan-esque. That IM team could work on.
For example?
For example, would be fallout from whatever holistic negotiations is gonna tell us on what the new mission is. Maybe that's its own IM team. I don't know. Maybe that's what the tank committee is for. I don't know. Any other decisions on what the long-term mission should be? Would be examples. Okay.
Matt, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against having this IM team, but I think that it should be kind of a light IM team where we take a look, we read System Plan 10 as we have time, we find if there's any faults that we've noticed or scenarios that we're really curious about, and kind of take that but roll it into an advice for System Plan 11. Right now, with 10 being out, it seems to me like we'd just be tilting against a windmill type of a deal to, issue advice or to put a lot of investment in that versus what do we want to do with System Plan 11. Admittedly, Dan advised that we're maybe a year too early for that. And with holistics coming out, I know I'll be a busy boy a little later. Well, maybe a little later this year. We'll find out. So, if we keep this IM team, we could do it kind of light style, and I don't mind being on it. But I would definitely have more of an eye looking towards the future of System Plan 11.
And Dan recommended coming back. He said that he and his counterpart would come back and have that conversation.
Yeah, for those that weren't on the board a couple of years ago, Dan mentioned it, that he and Jim, at the time, Jim Lynch came to the Tanks Committee, 2021, 2022, while they were, starting work on System Plan 10 and got informal feedback from the HAB committee at the time. That was a really good avenue. And I know that Dan said that, they seriously consider that in addition to the advice over the years. So that's another avenue where I know that Dan and DOE staff can come back. And I think, Paul said that, probably, and Dan said that about a year from now might be a good time, that they're gonna start working on things again, and that might be a time to come back to the HAB on things, potentially.
I think the idea of the inviting ecology to give additional scenarios was a comment made in previous system plans because they kind of ignored certain aspects of what ecology was interested in, like such as building new double shell tanks. And prior to this, that was never on the table. So that was, and I think my first question to him though is that lack of the infrastructure, the other support things, is what I didn't see in it. And yeah, I know cross-site transfer, they're inspecting and stuff. But again, I cannot fathom how ecology and allow them to use, to recertify a piping system that was built in, many years ago in codes that are not applicable at this point, in design codes, material codes, et cetera. So I just, I don't know how college is gonna do it. You're just gonna accept it, or are we going to say, okay, you gotta build it to ASME, piping code valid on, 2025 or whatever.
Wish I could give you the answer, but that technical level of detail is just.
Because on every one of those piping systems, you're gonna have
Come on,
to
Brian.
have signatures by professional engineers that are gonna look at that. And what professional engineer out there is gonna validate something that is, 20, 30 years old, designed by that code?
Well, you have your actually RPEs right now. Let's do that, for things that are 70 years old now.
Only because they have no option.
Well, no, they do have the option. I mean, they could not take it, but, I mean, they need to do it. So I think you could have an equivalent with a cross-site transfer line. My opinion, I am not a mechanical PE, and
Right.
so I can't tell you exactly that, but that should be a reasonable approach.
Well,
The Super 8 has been used, it's a sludge that has not been used. The Super 8 has not been used since like 2005, it's 5 or 6, maybe 7. I mean, so that was used once, several times. The last time in Britain, 20 years ago. But the sludge one has never been used. That's more of a challenge.
So as a new person, I've been trying to learn how things work, and it seems to me that the most workable situation for Department of Energy when they make decisions is budget first and regulation second and the TPA third. Now, this is not intentional, but seems to me that's the way these things generally work out. At least they're nudged in one direction or another. And I'm having trouble getting used to that, but on the other hand, that's pretty much like normal business in my mind. I've seen it before.
So I just wanted to step in here for a second. I think that Mr. Vance has shared that there is a risk-based decision-making approach that is utilized here at the Hanford site. So again, I'm not a technical person. So in the technical board, we've got technical topics. However, I just want to make sure we're bringing it back around to the topic that we have going on right now. I know that we were talking about system plan, potential to form an issue manager team, what that looks like. I don't know, Josh, if we want to kind of corral it back to that, or if we want to go on to requested topics for next committee meeting.
Yeah, so what I heard out of the system plan is you want to give people time to do their homework and maybe bring it back up when you feel there's a potential path forward, right?
Good.
Right.
The other option is that when Dan McDonald and Jeff Lyon, are those the two?
That's our ecology staff.
Right, so they previously come ahead of system plan.
Yeah, it was actually, it wasn't Jeff at the time, it was Jim Lynch from DOE.
Oh, sorry.
But that's somebody, I think we have Paul or another staff member, but yeah, it'd be, if Dan's still, yeah, Dan and DOE person.
So that's when the board gave feedback prior to doing, not like formal advice, but
Yeah,
they
that
were
last time.
asking the board for feedback. on
They specifically requested to come to the committee and talk to you guys about the Plan 10 and give the formal feedback.
Yeah.
We've actually done both. We,
Oh.
we have given formal advice, and
Yeah,
that
yeah.
other time we gave informal advice, and
Yeah,
and
there has
there's
been-
actually been more than one time we've given informal advice.
Yeah, and as Dan said, there's been about 4 or 5 pieces of advice, formal advice passed by the HAB related to system planning, that might, in addition to the homework on system plan 10, you guys might consider going back and reading the past advice that was passed by the board.
And there was a sounding board as well,
Oh, okay.
where folks chose their favorite system plan scenario. Also known as the John Price Challenge. I don't know if anybody remembers that. Besides me, Rob, do you remember that?
Yes, can we get John to come back? And then go to.
He's retired.
No, he's working for our,
Oh, is he?
He's in a
yeah,
different.
he transferred to the Eastern Regional Office, then he transferred to one of our offices on the west side. He's still working for ecology, but he might retire soon.
I thought he was retired.
That was an initial plan, we
Okay.
decided not to use.
That's right.
Police Ginger, and just went to a different office. Come back.
Is that under the white papers, that sounding board?
No, well, no, it would just be like a meeting summary, so
Oh, okay.
I think the John Price challenge, as I remember it, was he had asked the board to choose their favorite system plan scenario. However, as I'm sure one could assume, you couldn't have everybody agree on what their favorite scenario was and why. And so folks had a few minutes each and they went around the table and shared what their favorite system plan scenario was and their reason why.
Okay.
And so folks were able to provide that feedback in the full board setting.
Do you think that was 2019 or?
You'd have to go back and look. I don't, it's all a blur.
Okay.
But it is in the meeting summary.
One where I recall Dan McDowell seeking informal feedback from the tanks committee was either early 22 or late 21. I had a hard time pinpointing that one.
I remember it was definitely pandemic time.
Yeah, I remember being a virtual meeting, so I'm bounding it there.
Yeah, the last system plan was system plan in 2019. Yeah, that's what they commented on to include into this one.
Yeah.
But then 2019 would make sense.
Yeah, so
Well, okay, so that be done. Lindsay informed me that we will get a TBI presentation in the next meeting, June. And I really hope to put some advice into recognizing the importance for TBI. And so, yeah, that's in the future, but
okay, so step back that there's placeholders for April, but to my knowledge, this committee is not developing any advice for May. Is that right?
are we?
April is a placeholder for committees that are bringing forward advice at the May TAB meeting. Some committees are using the placeholder hold dates of April 17th and April 18th to have IM team discussion.
And when do we expect the TBI? You said in
June.
June. So I feel that we're off base if we try to do something on the drought issue prior to the presentation. So I'd say no.
So we'll release the April hold. And we're going, so June will be this committee's next meeting. We know that TBI is on the horizon. Is there anything else from DOE that's anticipated?
Not that I've had a time to track down, but that's the one that I got a yes to.
The other item that we're looking at but don't have confirmation of when yet was the environmental testing joint briefing between ecology and DOE for the DFLA environmental testing, but we're both tracking that down and yeah, we're both taking that action, so.
Is that the emission? Wasn't there something, I'm sorry, Nikki, I'm way off base. I'll stop.
There's a required environmental testing during the commissioning process of the filters. Yeah, that's what that, and it was, they talked a little bit about it earlier today. But yeah, that's something that actually, that Lindsay and I are both following up on that. We both, it sounds like we'll be able to do it. It's just a matter of when, so.
Right. Well, I did talk to Lindsay before a little bit maybe about a discussion on the off-gas system of DFLA in the next DFLA presentation or status or whatever. And the reason, yeah, and that reason is because it's a pretty complex system. There's, when I first looked at it, years ago, they took every kind of off-gas cleanup process they could imagine and combined them into one big drain. And so that's what you have. You've got a submerged scrubber, you've got wet electrostatic precipitator, you've got HEPA filters, you've got HEPA heaters, you've got carbon bed absorbers, you've got organic destruction through the SCO, and then the nitrate destruction through the TCO, and then you've got a caustic quencher for the gas, and then out the stack. And then a huge monitoring setup is on the stack. And so, that discussion would be nice, I think, for people to understand,
Apparently it's sensitive to someone opening the door in certain rooms.
Yeah, that talks about very sensitive. I know with the the big point was, is at one time was that, the whole idea of the blowers on the very end that are doing the big suck on the melter and the issues there. And yeah, that was a big design issue. Could it reach that far? And what do we have to do? And outgassing with carbon filters and so on and so forth.
And Rob, you also asked about amps. I'm also looking into that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
AMPS is the modular or.
Advanced modular pretreatment system.
Right.
Yeah, Fisker kind of new.
Fisker
was learned.
Yeah.
Fisker potentially put into West.
AMPS is, east area. It's increasing Fisker's capacity.
Super Tisker.
Yeah, Super Tisker. I don't know, I mean, I don't know its capacity, but Tisker's throughput is about half what WTP's nameplate throughput is. So they need additional treatment capacity.
Right.
And the June meeting is also an opportunity for committees to look at their interested items for the work plan going into the committee leadership workshop.
Right. Yeah, is there something we're missing in the whole picture of our tank, our renaming of our organization? Here, it's TWST and the S is stewardship. Is there something that we might be missing that we would be interested in?
I just have one quick update. I've updated this several times over the last year, and I told to the committees yesterday, but I think I've told the committee before that in addition to the test bed initiative, our D&D permit comment period that's starting Monday, we've got another research development demonstration. I say that so much lately. Our D&D permit for Newcon, which that was to evaluate the effectiveness of technologies in reducing the concentrations of tank vapor constituents. That comment period was originally gonna start towards the end of April. That's been pushed back a bit. My understanding is looking like, I think, roughly June timeframe. So I just wanted to update you on the timing of that, just for awareness.
So would you like us to, would you like to give us a presentation or something on on anything there?
Let me go follow with my staff, and I know we'll have a planning call for the June meeting with you, and I can commit to having an answer by then. But I'll go ask our permitting staff about that particular one and see if we can do a briefing or just another update or what that would look like. But I can commit to go follow up on that for you.
The TBI, would you like us to start reading up on that and if we have comments?
Well, so just for awareness again for TBI, so that comment period starting Monday, going 45 days, there's gonna be a joint Ecology is gonna host a public meeting on March 20th with Energy. So there's gonna be a presentation on the RD&D permit by Ecology and kind of that process, and then Energy is gonna do a presentation on TBI at the public meeting. And that's gonna be for 45 days. I think I already said that, but so when that stuff comes out Monday, definitely encourage you to go take a look-see at things, and you can always holler at Brian if you have any questions. So.
Okay.
We'll make sure to send that calendar invite or the information about the public meeting to the board.
Yeah, I think we can include on there the have happenings for the meeting information.
Sure everyone's aware.
Okay. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, two comments. So the first one is, just wanted to reiterate, Hanford Challenge has not changed its position on grout, so writing advice specific to TBI, probably, would not reach consensus. Just want to be clear on that. And then, I did want to add, say that would love a presentation on Newcon, and maybe that can be a joint, presentation with LID, since it is worker safety as well, and vapors, so, and protecting workers. So would love to see that. And then some other ideas I had, not, obviously not for June, but like looking ahead towards the work plan, for next year. Cross-site transfer lines, we talked a lot about it today, but we haven't had a briefing on those in a while. And I don't know if we could be updated on them, and hearing that they may not be in compliance or may not be able to use them. Just be interested in hearing about that
Okay.
in like the broader tank waste mission. And then similar 242A evaporator. I realize it's been down for a while. Kind of what's the status, and there's a freeze event. And so just an update on that, since that's a really critical part of all of this.
Okay.
And I think those were my things.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for June, sounds like we have one highly likely and then a handful of potentials. So we got TBI being most likely, environmental testing as a maybe, request for off-gas and amps, and then Yukon as a maybe, all for June.
That sounds accurate for the maybes, right, Lindsay?
Correct.
I'd imagine out of that list, we could get 2 of them, so.
Exactly. And then we'll carve out some time for being business for the committee to provide its input to the leadership workshop.
So the thing that Tom says to me a lot is that we have a way of giving advice without consensus. And so we should kind of talk a little bit about that, because Hanford challenges position. And, you know, I think we should understand what the ramifications were if we were to try to offer advice that would not have consensus.
It's not called advice, though. It would be like a sounding board.
Is that what Tom said?
It would be like what was done for FFTF, where each interest on the board expressed their feelings about FFTF, and it was all documented as a sounding board.
The term would be a have product rather than advice.
Good.
Right.
Jacob, did you have something?
Yeah, I guess, that was a perfect segue. So we used to have a grout IM team. And it seemed like it sort of died at the beginning of the year when all the leadership of it left the board. Do we still have it? Do we still want it? Do we?
Well, I haven't, I talked to Lindsay here about trying to get that presentation on the TBI initiative.
Yeah.
And trying to get advice based upon the TBI, not routing everything at this point, but saying, go forward with this research program, prove that it works, or prove that it doesn't work. And then we'll have more information or they would have more information for using that for SLA or supplemental LEW waste. I personally, our remove, treat, and dispose. Remove it from the tanks, immobilize it in grout, and dispose of it at the safest place they can. And that's not here. So.
Yeah, I mean, so the last IM team meeting, I presented the advice that I thought that was positioned on grout neutral. Here are things that, my advice was along the lines of, here are things that I see people are in inhibition, why people won't accept grout. Here are questions I think that you want to answer. And I think whether you like grout or not, you'd be interested in seeing those questions answered. And so, my thought is, I think there is some advice, maybe not pro, hey, to go TBI, but there might be some pro, give us information that is lacking in the world, right? So and that, so I just want to throw out, I think there is some advice that I think we could get out if people are on board. So I got kind of yeah, that's really interesting, but no one was standing up and saying, we want to go for it. So.
Jacob, are you saying that, for example, what questions would need to be answered, if looking at ground as a technology?
Yeah. So I mean, an example that I had on my list is, hey, DOE, you in the 90s considered ground and chose vitrification instead. What is different between now and the 90s? And they kind of showed us where they are, but they never showed us, well, what's that delta? And that would be an example of the sort of things that I think they ought to explain. Now, I know the answer. Not really.
Yeah,
But-
one second. Use would be as good as gravel. What does that mean?
Yeah,
I mean, rather, as good as glass.
glass, yeah.
As good as glass.
You know, glass isn't very good.
That was a statement.
I'll tell you that if you gave Jake Reynolds 10 million bucks, I would be happily making grout that's way more durable than glass. Easy as pie, easy as pie. Total, I mean, I could make it 1,000,000 times more durable than glass. It's just all of, what your objectives are.
In the late eighties,
10
or
million
early
is
eighties,
unsound.
when we were working and supporting Congress with the Waste Policy Act of
Yeah.
'82 that decided geologic disposal. It didn't matter whether the waste form is the package that counted. And so that's why Yucca Mountain essentially down selected from the 5 other places, because of the environment around Yucca Mountain was resistant to the package.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Now we discredit the package, pretend it's not there.
Yeah.
Even though it almost certainly lasts for.
Well,
hundreds of
in
thousands
an
of
environment,
years.
you can't predict some degradation mechanism of the package.
Who would expect it a 304L line to leak within a couple of weeks of use, but, so I guess I'll shoot my point in the foot, but, yeah.
Plus, one of the considerations for, TPI, to ship liquid, wasn't that an early consideration?
Well, I think it still is. Yeah.
Yes,
And-
keep it outside for.
Yeah, and the fact that we ship liquid, radioactive liquid all over the United States already. I mean, it's been done, West Valley, Savannah River, and so it's not uncommon to do that, commercial nuclear stations, et cetera. So that's a demonstrated feasibility already. I think.
Concerned with tank places and segments.
Oh, Josh.
Ryan, sorry I missed you outside the committee corner. Do you have something to contribute?
You're good. I was just, I've been looking at, this is related, I promise. I've been looking at the Rev 9 advice lately, as we've been looking at Rev 9 coming up and our response to that advice. And what I noticed, because obviously I wasn't here when that advice was passed, but, it reads to me that the Rev 9 advice back, a decade or so ago wasn't actually a consensus piece of advice, and the HAB OGR outlines what happens when full consensus can't be achieved, just for awareness of process. I pasted that excerpt in the chat, but I wanted to share my screen really quick to show an excerpt from the advice 262 on the site-wide permit last year. This is just because I heard the discussion going on around advice. So this is at the end of the advice where Susan signed it, but you'll see it says, I'm going to zoom in on here, sorry guys. This advice is not a consensus product. The following 2 members objected to the advice going forward, and then it showed that. And then there's an addenda to this advice that has the minority or dissenting opinion. And then if you look at the chat that I just put in, this is just quoting the HAB OGR just for awareness. The board recognizes there are several levels of consensus that may be possible. The first is unanimous agreement among all board members on the advice to convey. The second is a consensus that can be characterized as all board members being willing to, quote, live with a proposed set of advice. The third is one or more board members registering dissent, but not wishing to block the board from providing advice that might otherwise be characterized as a consensus of the board, but for their dissent. And conveying consensus advice to the agencies, it will be incumbent upon the board and its chair to accurately describe the level of consensus that has been achieved. So I just wanted to just go throw it out there, since I just noticed the Rev 9 advice from a decade ago wasn't a full consensus project. So just wanted to put that out there for
But it was advice, not a big old sounding board.
Well, if you back up to it, Susan, was that advice with dissenting viewpoint? Was that formal advice?
Correct.
Yeah, so that's the other, the OGR, what I've seen in other processes similar to this is that the receiving agencies are better off hearing the perspectives of the advisory committee. It is not consensus. It is advice, and here are the different viewpoints. So the one that we had with Susan, it's like there were basically three different perspectives. One that many people coalesced around, and then individual ones that were detailed. I mean,
Yeah, in addition, I scrolled to the top of the advice, in addition to the actual advice points, you'll see the line here that says accompanying this advice is separate documents or addendum 1 and addendum 2, which provide explanatory background. Addendum 1 includes specific information that may improve the permit's content and guidance to ecology. Much like a sounding board, this addendum is not a consensus project. Instead, it represents an unedited collection of responses to the permit by individual board members. And then they've got addendum 2, which is actually, we just talked about that. Yes, addendum 2 is not a consensus project. So this advice was a monster. It had a couple pages of the advice points, which was not a consensus product, except because it had 2 dissenting opinions. And then there were 2 additional addendum to it. One of them was essentially a sounding board.
Right.
So just putting all that up there.
So being mindful of our 2 minutes remaining. So the initial question, the Grout IM team is still on record. We have Rob leading it, Mia and Jacob both as members. I would suggest that maybe the IM team take some time to think about what forms a product could take and revisit it following this TBI presentation we're expecting in June for the June 30 business.
Good idea.
Is there any other committee business we need to cover to conclude this meeting?
Only that you should close it.
See your
This meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.